The craziest prison escapes of all time. The Alcatraz escape. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, better known as Alcatraz, is likely the most iconic prison in the entire world. Alcatraz sits on top of a small island in the San Francisco Bay and started its life in the 1850s as a military fort, and then was converted to a military prison in the 1910s. And in the 1930s, the United States Department of Justice bought the military prison and turned it into what we know it as today, a former maximum security federal prison. Alcatraz was notorious for a couple of reasons, both of those reasons being extremely tied together. For starters, it was notorious because it was literally seen as an escape-proof prison. And that was because it combined the highest level technology possible within the walls of this prison, and it also coupled that with timeless prehistoric technology outside of the prison walls. What I mean by that is the literal mile of rough, shark-infested water surrounding the prison, making it extremely unique and almost one of a kind. Because sure, being inside a maximum security prison with all of the bells and whistles is one thing, but having all of those in combination with being on a remote island surrounded by rough, shark-infested water is just a whole nother level. And that is partially what made Alcatraz so famous. But obviously, they don't build these prisons for great people. These federal maximum security prisons exist for a reason, which brings us to the second reason why this prison was so notorious. It was home to some of the most infamous criminals of its time. For example, Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, and a bunch of others. So yeah, it's safe to assume that Alcatraz was likely the one prison that nobody could escape from. And from 1933 until 1962, that was considered true. There was multiple escape attempts, but none that were considered successful. That was until June 11th of 1962, when three men would cause not only national headlines, but also an ongoing mystery that still puzzles the world to this very day. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were lifelong criminals, and by the time they had ended up at Alcatraz, they were no strangers to escape attempts. Frank Morris started his criminal career at the age of 13 and lived a life of crime primarily consisting of drugs and robbery. And throughout his time being in and out of this system, he had escaped multiple times from multiple different correctional facilities. He was likely able to escape due to his extremely high intelligence, and is recorded to have an IQ of 133, which is in the top 2% of the general population. But unfortunately, he decided to use his powers for evil. On the other hand, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, didn't start their criminal career much later. Clarence was caught breaking into a service station when he was only 14 years old, and the brothers began robbing banks together not long after. They too had multiple escape attempts and successful escapes on their record, which may not come as a surprise considering the context of this video. Now that we have all of the information, one question still remains. What happens when you mix an inescapable prison with criminals that cannot be contained? Well, the answer lies in the following story. A story that is shrouded in irony, because sure, why wouldn't you want to have all of the extremely dangerous bad guys in one place? Well, because then you have all of the bad guys in one place where they can work together. And that is exactly what happened. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West actually knew each other from previous convictions in Florida and Georgia. I guess you really are the sum of the 5 people you hang out with. Regardless, with all of their histories of prison escapes, it didn't take long for them to begin plotting their escape from Alcatraz, the prison that you're supposedly not able to escape. And after coming together to join forces, they come up with a plan to escape. And this plan starts by chipping away at cement. Oh, and if you're curious why I didn't mention Alan West earlier, you'll see why later. Just trust me. Obviously, being in a maximum security prison leaves minimal opportunities for easy escapes. But these criminals identified the weakest point of their cell being not the door, but the vent that was hidden under everybody's sink. And for a 6-month period, all 4 of these men begin widening the ducts beneath their sinks using saw blades, metal spoons, electric drill bits, anything they could get their hands on that would chip away at the cement. Now this alone brings up 2 questions. How did they hide the hole, and how did they cover the sound of chipping away at cement? Well, 2 simple answers. In regards to how they would hide chipping away at the hole, first of all, these men would take turn being on guard, watching for the guards that would typically only do their hourly patrol, but sometimes would do spontaneous patrols as well, where they would need to obviously make sure that the guards did not see them digging these holes. And once their daily digging session was complete, how they concealed them from the guards throughout the rest of the day when they weren't digging them was actually quite clever. All of these men made papier-mâché replicas of the vent and surrounding wall area, painted in the same color as the wall, from paint that one of these men stole from their prison job. How they covered the noise of digging was was because one of the men actually played the accordion, and during music hour was the perfect opportunity to quickly and loudly bang away at the cement. Now, after roughly 6 months of digging, all of these men had access to what was behind their wall. And obviously, this hole just didn't go outside. It led to a gap between the walls, consisting primarily of pipes. This unguarded utility area between cells was the perfect place to assess the situation. And once these men had access to this corridor, they climbed the pipes and found the closest exit they could find, which happened to be a vacant top-level cell block where they set up a secret workshop. The men weren't going to be escaping at this point in time, but they were getting extremely close to their great escape. In this vacant cell block, the men identified their escape route, which was a ceiling vent that they would need to pry open, but for them, that was no big task. And they spent the next few months bringing supplies up to their secret workshop, specifically raincoats, glues, magazines, pieces of plywood, anything that would be helpful and useful for their escape. Over time, the men were beginning to stitch together raincoats to build a makeshift raft and putting together pieces of plywood to make makeshift paddles, and also reading magazines about water safety and mechanics to help educate themselves on the best way to essentially act on the water and make something to potentially float across the water. It was really quite ingenious. And once they had their raft, paddle, and escape vent pried open, they were ready to make their escape. Around 10 p.m. on June 11th, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers got out of their bed, put replica papier-mâché heads into their bed to make it appear that they were still in bed, and met up together in their secret workshop, where they grabbed their raft, broke the ceiling vent, and began their escape. These men climbed out of the vent on the ceiling onto the roof of Alcatraz, and then descended 50 feet off of the prison roof onto the prison grounds, hauling all of their gear while sliding down a kitchen vent pipe. The men somehow avoided the sniper towers and outdoor guards and climbed the 12-foot barbed wire fences and planted their boat in water on the shore that was a blind spot to searchlights and gun towers. And at that point, they had inflated their raft with an accordion and set sail. And the 3 of these men were never seen again. Now you might be asking yourself, wait, the 3 of these men? What happened to the 4th man? Well, Alan West wasn't as lucky as the other criminals. And on the night of the escape, when West tried to remove the papier-mâché concrete concoction that was covering the hole in the wall, he couldn't. The concrete that he had used to temporarily hold the vent in place during the day had hardened. And by the time he finally got the vent off and was able to make it to the secret workshop, the rest of the men were gone. And West simply accepted his fate and went back to his cell where he went to bed. That story alone is insane, and it's still not over yet. The 3 men had essentially made the perfect escape, and nobody knew of their escape until the next morning, when guards were doing their rounds and noticed that these 3 men were not waking up. And when one of the guards tried to poke Frank Morris in the head with his club, Morris's head literally fell to the ground. And it was at that moment when the prison guards had discovered that they had 3 men on the loose. The following day, on June 12th, almost instantly, military and law enforcement agencies began investigations on the air, land, and sea surrounding the prison. And while some bits and pieces of items used by the escapees were found spread across the general area, there is no recorded evidence of what happened to the 3 men after they left the Alcatraz grounds. During the investigation that took place on the 12th, Alan West was caught with his papier-mâché replica head. And at this point, the guards knew what the head was going to be used for. And Alan was about to be in a lot of trouble. And because of that, Alan was willing to give up all of the information he had to ensure that he didn't get in too much trouble for having this papier-mâché head. And fortunately, he did, because Alan is the biggest reason why we have all of the information we have about this entire escape. Without Alan essentially ratting on his friends, a lot of this prison escape would have been left to speculation. Now, if you want to get into a bit of conspiracy, since their escape, there has been alleged sightings of these escaped men, some in the United States, some in Brazil, and a letter has even surfaced supposedly being written from one of these escapees to a loved one, claiming that all of the men made it out alive, although none of these were ever confirmed. And it's very likely that all of the men that escaped Alcatraz that day either died during their escape or are dead now due to natural causes, or simply due to the consequences of living a life of crime. So yeah, when you mix a prison that is impossible to escape with prisoners that are impossible to keep confined, you get an ongoing mystery that lasts over 60 years. But as crazy as this story may be, we still have 2 more to cover. The Catch Me If You Can escapes. When you were a kid on the playground playing tag with your friends, did you ever say, "Catch me if you can," while running away? Well, Frank Abagnale said "catch me if you can" every day to the FBI for years while on the run for stealing millions of dollars and breaking a laundry list of other laws. The story of Frank Abagnale literally inspired the movie Catch Me If You Can. And today, I'm gonna tell the real story of exactly how he escaped prison both times. I did give a bit of a teaser on why he was put in jail, but let me give a bit more context. Frank Abagnale started at an early age, similar to the first story, when he moved to New York at the age of 16 by himself. He quickly realized that as a child, you can't do much, so he decided to no longer be a child. He altered his driver's license to say 26, not 16. Not only does he need to be an adult, but he needs money, and living in New York is not cheap. So what's the natural next step? Get a job, right? Earn some money? Of course not. You start defrauding banks with fraudulent checks. And that's exactly where Frank Abagnale Jr. started his infamous streak of conning and crime. Frank wasn't your average run-of-the-mill fraudster, and he was rather clever and charming. And one of the biggest reasons why he was able to get away with his crimes for so long is because he was a serial imposter, specifically by impersonating professionals when cashing these checks so that there was less scrutiny and chance of being figured out. He faked being a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and other white-collar professions to ensure that he was not on anybody's radar. And obviously, it worked. After collecting millions of dollars from these fraudulent checks and living a luxurious lifestyle and traveling the world on money that wasn't his, Frank was ultimately caught. Frank was initially caught in France, where he spent time in both French prisons and Swedish prisons. And after serving time in both countries and being banned from Sweden, Frank was deported back to the United States of America. And when Frank's plane landed in New York City, while it was still on the tarmac, Frank was able to escape the plane through the kitchen galley. And not only did he escape the plane through the galley, but he also escaped from the airport on foot. Keep in mind, airports are pretty secure places. And I guess this was, a different time, if you know what I mean. But still, that's a pretty crazy feat. This is the tame prison escape of the two, which is why I'm kind of covering it a bit quickly. Frank ended up being on the run for a few weeks until he was caught once again, this time at the Montreal airport. You'd think this guy would have learned his lesson around airports, but I guess not. It's also a bit ironic that he was caught in Quebec, a French-speaking Canadian province. Regardless, it's this second capture which sparks the crazy story of his second escape from prison. Frank was sent to a federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was awaiting his trial. And it was at this detention center where he pulled off the most lucky and almost funny prison escapes. The US Marshal that brought Frank Abagnale into this detention center somehow managed to forget Abagnale's paperwork. And this gave Abagnale a lot of room to come up with convenient stories. And the story that he began to spin was that he was a prison inspector, a secret shopper of penitentiaries, if you will. And because of this, although he was incarcerated, he was given very special treatment, specifically by the guards. One of the most interesting perks that Frank got was he actually wasn't even in a prison jumpsuit. He was allowed to wear street clothes, which may seem simple, but is a huge privilege. So even though Frank is locked up, he's not necessarily in a bad situation. Guards are speculating that because there's no papers, he must be a prison inspector. Frank is definitely not gonna tell them that's not the case. He's being given special treatment in this jail, which is almost unheard of. And he then gets the idea that, maybe I can get out of this place. And that's exactly where his escape begins. After he decided that he was going to escape, he calls his girlfriend, as he knew that he would need somebody on the outside to help validate the story he was about to tell. When he called his girlfriend, he ensured that she had an FBI business card from an agent that previously visited her due to some other things that Frank was up to, and then he asked her to impersonate a magazine writer, which she did, and she used this fake writer persona to set up a meeting with the real police inspector, who she would also get the business card of, which was the entire point of the meeting. Once Frank's girlfriend had the FBI's card and the prison inspector's card, they were well on their way to breaking Frank out. She went to a local paper copy place and made 500 copies of the FBI agent's business card, but she changed the contact number on the business card to a payphone in a mall. During her next visit, she gave Frank both of these business cards. And with these business cards in hand, Frank was able to convince prison guards that he, in fact, was a prison inspector. Frank convinced one of these guards that he had an urgent meeting with the FBI and that he needed to be released immediately, and he even urged the guard to call the FBI agent's number on the business card that he had, which he did. And when this prison guard called the FBI agent, it was really Abagnale who was waiting at the mall. And Abagnale played that part perfectly, claiming that Frank had extremely sensitive information that he needed to give to her immediately, and that this information was too high level for this prison guard to be made aware of. And for that reason, the FBI agent was going to come pick up Frank at once, because his prison inspection had come to a close. And later that day, prison guards walked Frank directly out of the prison, allowing him to walk directly into his girlfriend's car, and Frank drove off into the sunset once again as a free man. Although this perfect escape didn't have a perfect ending. At least, not in the way that he thought, because he was caught only a month later in New York. Frank was sentenced to 12 years in prison, where he actually ended up only serving 5, as he made a deal with the FBI that he would be released early if he would help the FBI on fraud cases and teach them all of the tricks that he used to commit all of the crimes that he did. A good deal both ways around. Now, the story actually ended up having a bit of a happy ending because Frank really did turn his life around. He was able to be a very valuable asset to the FBI. He actually met his wife while doing FBI work and had 3 sons, and one of his sons is actually now an FBI agent. And while the escape story was utter insanity, one of the most interesting facts about this entire case is the fact that after all of the crimes were committed, all of the time on the run, and all of the jail time was served, Frank was only 26 years old, which means that everything I just described happened when he was 16 to 26. This man literally lived a lifetime's worth of life in a decade, and it's no wonder that he had such a successful book and eventual movie adaptation. There's obviously a lot more to Frank's life story, but that's beyond the scope of this video. And speaking on beyond the scope of this video, let me just say this. When doing research for this video, I found so many insane stories about people escaping prison in literally insane ways. And for this video, I wanted to pick some pretty famous examples that were verifiably crazy and also somewhat well known. However, I do have a list of over 30 other examples of people who escaped prison around the world in the most insane ways. So if you guys loved this video and would like a part 2 about more obscure and more unknown prison escapes, please let me know in the comments that you would love a part 2 to this video, and I would be more than happy to make it. Maybe if this video hits 20,000 likes, I'll make a follow-up. Your guys' support truly means a lot. Now, let's get to our third crazy prison break story. The Japanese prison break. Yoshie Shiratori is likely one of the most famous escape artists from all of Japan, and he didn't have a career in magic. He unfortunately had a life of crime. Yoshie lost his father at the age of 2, and his own mother abandoned him shortly after. And as an adolescent, he worked at a tofu shop, and then later became a fisherman catching crabs in Russia. However, after succumbing to a crippling gambling addiction, he turned to a life of crime. Throughout his crime career, Yoshie famously escaped from 4 different prisons, and I'm about to tell you about every single one of them. Yoshie was initially put behind bars in 1936 for a felony murder charge, a murder charge that is speculated to have been a false, forced confession from abusive prison guards. Regardless, Yoshie was in prison, and during this time in the early 1900s, Japanese prison was extremely harsh, and it was for that reason that people were almost left no other option than try to escape because the living conditions were simply so horrible. And Yoshie was no different. Not long after being locked up, Yoshie began studying the routines of the guards to have an understanding of their patterns so he could potentially plan an escape. And one day, while cleaning himself in the bathhouse, he found the perfect tool to escape. He took one of the metal bands off of a wash bucket in the bathhouse and brought it back to his cell, where he was able to fashion this thin, flimsy piece of metal into a makeshift lockpick. And he used this lockpick to escape. He first waited for the guards to pass by his cell, and then he put pieces of wood underneath a blanket on his bed to make it appear that he was in his cell. And then he began picking the lock directly on the front door of his cell. One of the most brazen escapes we've talked about so far in this video. After successfully picking the lock on his own cell, he was free from his cell, but still behind many other locked doors. And surprisingly, he was able to successfully lockpick through numerous other doors and successfully escape the prison and achieve freedom once again. But this is only his first escape of many, as 3 days after his initial escape, he was already back in police custody because he was found stealing supplies from a local hospital. Because of this escape and attempted theft, he was given another life sentence and transferred to a different prison. Originally, Yoshie was actually placed back in the original prison he escaped from, but during World War II in 1942, Yoshie was actually transferred to another prison, known as Akita Prison, where he found himself in harsher conditions. And the guards at this prison were very privy to his escape attempts, and they wanted to make sure that they made an example out of Yoshie. One of the additional punishments that Yoshie received at this new prison was extended solitary confinement. And these solitary confinement rooms were literally designed for escape artists. They had smooth copper walls, the ceiling was extremely high, and the only way in and out was the front door, besides a skylight that was at the very top of the very high ceiling, which obviously nobody could reach. Right? Well, almost anybody couldn't reach. Because on June 15th, in solitary confinement, Yoshie decided to escape once again. When I say Yoshie was a master escape artist, I mean it. And he was able to escape this unescapable room. And how he did it was he first got out of his handcuffs. Oh yeah, he was literally kept in handcuffs 24/7 in this new prison just because they wanted to make extra sure he would not escape. But obviously that didn't stop him. He escaped these handcuffs by finding a piece of wire once again in this solitary confinement. Where it came from, we don't know. but regardless, he used it to unpick his handcuffs. At this point, his hands were free, and he began to use his bare palms and feet to scale the sides of this extremely tall prison cell. Not only was Yoshie a master lockpicker, but he was also a very talented climber, and this came in handy here. And after a few attempts, he was able to make it to this skylight, which was sealed by metal bars and impossible to escape through, besides the fact that it had a wooden frame securing those metal bars. And that wooden frame was rotting due to its exposure to the elements. Now, Yoshie wasn't able to just break this wood frame in one go, but similar to the first story where the men broke through the concrete over time, Yoshie over time was able to pick away at the wooden window frame until he was able to escape through the roof of this unescapable room. Once Yoshie was certain that the wooden frame was brittle enough, he waited until a particularly stormy night to bust through the roof, as he assumed on a stormy night the guards would be less likely to suspect tapping on the ceiling to be footsteps and more likely to simply write them off as rain, which is exactly what he did, and it worked flawlessly. And once again, Yoshie was a free man. Now this time you must be asking yourself, okay, obviously he didn't steal again, right? He escaped prison twice, almost an impossible feat. There's no way he was going to steal again to go back to prison, right? And you're technically right, but obviously he did go back to jail because we still have 2 more escapes to talk about. And the reason he was sent back to prison is rather unique. After his 3 months of essentially homeless freedom, he decided to pay one of the head guards from Akita prison a visit, because this head guard was one of the only ones who never beaten and abused him. The guard recognized Yoshie at his door and let him in and fed Yoshie and allowed him to tell his story. And Yoshie explained to the head guard that he was here simply to tell him his plan because he deserved to know, because he was the only one who treated Yoshie well. Yoshie explained how he wanted to go to America to raise awareness about the human rights violations that were taking place in Japanese prison, and hopefully through this awareness and a civil lawsuit be able to gain his freedom once again. And while this head guard seemed to be respectful and listening, when Yoshie went to use the washroom, this head guard unsurprisingly called the police and Yoshie was sent back to prison once again. Now this time, Yoshie requested that he at least go to a Tokyo prison where it's a bit warmer, because the first 2 prisons he had spent time in were in the northern part of Japan where it was relatively cold, which only added to the distress that he experienced within prison. However, this 3rd prison he was sent to was not in Tokyo and not in a warm climate at all. It was actually the northernmost prison in all of Japan, known as Abashiri Prison. And the guards at this prison were not messing around. At this point, they knew this man was extremely clever and not only escaped from 1 prison, but from 2, using different methods. And when they booked him into this 3rd prison, they made sure that he would never escape again. He was in a cell that only had openings that were smaller than the human body, so he could not possibly escape. He was given custom fit ankle cuffs and arm cuffs that were behind his back without keyholes, so they could not possibly be picked. And he was almost always by himself in freezing cold condition. And on top of this, his life sentence was only extended due to his additional escape. So realistically, at this point, Yoshie had nothing to live for. His arms and legs were bound, there was absolutely no opportunity for escape, and he was alone all of the time, freezing cold and poorly treated. But somehow, Yoshie still had one more trick up his sleeve. While confined in this hellhole, Yoshi's body was basically useless, but his mind was definitely not. And what he did to escape Abashiri prison was absolutely insane. He realized that the cell that he was being held in was made primarily of iron, and the food that he was given every single day was a very salty miso soup. And while he needed to eat as much of his food as possible to live, he always left a little bit of miso soup behind, which he would splash directly on the bolts of the observation window on the door and on the hinges of his handcuffs and ankle cuffs. And slowly, over time, the salt and oxygen exposure on this metal would slowly cause it to rust and weaken. And after 6 months of slowly deteriorating the metal that confined him, he was able to make a move. Once again, at night, he started by fully removing his leg cuffs and then his arm cuffs, and then began the true challenge. He began unbolting the observation window on the front door of his cell, but there was still one problem. Even with the observation window bars removed, the hole was still too small for the human body. Well, at least the average human body. Yoshie was, of course, a talented contortionist. Maybe because he was ultra flexible, or maybe just because he was ultra determined, he was able to dislocate his shoulders to shove his torso through this observation window and flop himself on the ground outside of his cell, almost free. He later broke through an unprotected window in the ceiling in a different part of the jail and was once again a free man, and also the first person ever to escape from Abashiri prison, one of the most brutal Japanese prisons ever. But similar to Alcatraz, the risks associated with escaping this prison weren't just within the walls. Even if you escape this prison, you are still in an extremely remote northern part of Japan with no civilization around you, extremely cold temperatures, and on top of all of this, mountain bears. But somehow, Yoshie still survived. He ended up finding an abandoned mine shaft in one of the nearby mountains and was able to live in there alone, primarily eating nuts, berries, small animals in the area, and even crab fishing, which he reported to have learned from watching the bears do it, which is insane if true. But here's the thing, Yoshie didn't die in this mine shaft. He obviously got a bit restless and decided that it was worth risking going back into civilization and made the long trek to the nearest city, where he was surprised to see English and American soldiers and what seemed to be a huge change in the culture. And that's when he grabbed a newspaper and got caught up to date. During his 2 years spent in this abandoned mine shaft, World War II had come to a close, Japan had surrendered, and America, for the most part, had taken over the entire penitentiary system, which to Yoshie was a huge relief because he assumed at that point that there would be huge reform and at the very least, they'd be less on his case. And with this newfound information, he felt more confident to try to return to his family. But it was on this 50-day journey from where he was to his family that he found himself in trouble once again. Starving on his journey, he decided to pick some tomatoes from a tomato field that he was passing. And the farmer who owns this field just so happened to see Yoshie take these tomatoes. And this farmer mistook Yoshie for a local thief. The two ended up fighting, and the farmer ended up dying as a result of the fight. Some claims state that Yoshie killed this man accidentally, and others claim that it was legitimate self-defense. Regardless, the farmer was killed, and Yoshie once again was caught. But initially, they didn't even know who they had. They only thought they had a murderer, but once he was fully booked, they realized that they had the infamous escapist Yoshie Shirotori. And he was no longer sentenced to life in prison, he was sentenced to death. The year is now 1947, and Yoshie is being sent to Sapporo prison, where he will await his execution. And obviously, because Yoshie has now escaped 3 different prisons using 3 different methods and now has theft and murder under his belt, the police are taking absolutely no chances with this final cell. Yoshie is being given 24/7 surveillance, reinforced doors and bars, and any opening that leads to this room is smaller than the human head. Because no matter how good of a contortionist you are, you can't make your skull smaller. So in this situation, there is absolutely no way that Yoshie escapes, right? This is obviously where the story ends. He was obviously later executed by the Japanese government, and that's history, right? Of course not. This is Yoshie we're talking about. And interestingly, this is one of the most simple escapes he performed. Because since day 1 in this jail cell, Yoshie started playing mind games, specifically by always looking up. Yoshie, up until this point, had always escaped through the roof, and his guards knew that. And every day when the guards would check on him, Yoshie would make sure that he was looking up. And as a result, the guards were always looking up, making sure that when they would check on Yoshie, they would always check the ceiling. But this escape had nothing to do with the ceiling, and Yoshie was going in the opposite direction. Yoshie's cell was fortified on the walls, ceiling, openings, but one place that wasn't fortified was the floor. And over the course of a month, Yoshie would remove a floorboard and begin digging into the floor below his bed, in secrecy until he had a usable tunnel. And once again, one morning, the guards were unable to get a response out of Yoshie. And when they entered his cell, they realized that what was in his bed wasn't Yoshie, but once again, a pile of wood. Almost a calling card at this point. And for a year, Yoshie was on the run. And as you may or may not know, he did go back to jail one last time. But this time was different. He ended up confessing to a random police officer who decided to offer him a cigarette in public. And at this point, Yoshie could not handle the guilt, and he confessed everything to this police officer who was simply offering a gesture of kindness. But when Yoshie was tried again, things were different. The system treated him with sympathy. Reform seemed to have taken place. The murder charge he had was dropped and considered self-defense. And as a result, so was his execution. His request to go to a Tokyo prison was accepted, and his new sentence was only 20 years. 20 years which he happily served, as his prison conditions were much better. And after 14 out of those 20 years, Yoshie was paroled on good behavior, and was for the first time in a long time, a truly free man. This story is insane, and I knew I had to save it for last. And while some claim parts are exaggerated, personally, I don't even care. I think it's a great story. And for that reason, Yoshie is a bit of a legend in Japan, and there are even statues up of him, which is kind of interesting. But I suppose the story is something you can learn from. Yoshie passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, but he still lives on today in folklore, stories like this, films, books, and other stuff like that. The craziest battles in human history. No, not epic rap battles of history, the craziest battles of history. In this video, I'm going to discuss battles that were crazy and undoubtedly had an impact on history. Let's get started. The year is 1204 AD. You are an ambitious leader with the sole goal of unifying all of Mongolia under a single banner, bringing together all of the nomadic tribes into one mega civilization, something that has never been done before. Your life has not been easy. Since birth, your life has been a cycle of life and death, with almost everybody you know being involved in battle and dying. This brutal lifestyle was relatively normal for the tribes living in the Mongolian steppe, although it doesn't make it any easier. Through focus and sheer dedication, you have become an extremely powerful leader, and you are close to achieving your goal of unifying all of Mongolia, with now only one obstacle standing in your way. Another great Mongolian warrior named Jamaka, a leader who holds almost opposite values to yours, with the goal of preserving tradition and keeping historic practices alive, specifically focusing on family ties. This opposing leader was also one of your childhood best friends, and someone you considered to be a blood brother, someone who brought stability and joy to your life. Someone who, unfortunately, over the years you had grown apart from due to ideological differences. And now, this battle in which you are about to embark on is the conclusion of your long brewing rivalry, and will solidify a massive change not only in the history of Mongolia, but also in the history of the world. Today is the day you find yourself standing in a battlefield. You and your army are slowly approaching a much larger army, an army that is led by Jamaka. It's hard to not feel confident when you have an army of 66,000 trained warriors. However, when your enemy outnumbers you by multiples, you need to get creative. While your army begins to approach the army of the enemy, you signal your army to spread out as wide as possible, not only to make your army appear larger than it is, but also to subconsciously encourage the enemy army to do the exact same. As the armies approach closer and closer, you have two extremely long lines of warriors headed directly at each other. And all of a sudden, you signal your entire army with the blow of a horn, a signal you taught them months prior. And at that point, your army collapses from a long army into a narrow, almost arrow formation penetrating the enemy line. This strategy was extremely effective and almost instantly shattered any strategy that Jamaka's army had, and now they are clueless in trying to pick up the pieces. During this bloodshed and confusion, the leaders of the opposing force, including Jamaka, fled, leaving their soldiers essentially abandoned. And it was at this point when you and your army killed who you had to and capture all who were willing to submit. As the sun sets and the dust settles, you reflect on the epic battle that you just embarked on, now with an army that is double the size that you started with. And due to this battle, you are well on your way to unifying the Mongolian people, the goal that started this entire battle in the beginning. And this long-lasting feud with Jamaka, your ex-childhood best friend and current arch-nemesis. The outcome of this battle and unified people led to a seemingly unstoppable army, and the victor of the Battle of the 13 Sides. And what you and your army would go on to achieve would become known as the largest contiguous army in all of human history. And you, who formerly would be known as Temujin, would go on to solidify your name as Genghis Khan. For me, this battle is crazy for a lot of reasons. Not only is it the story of a modest army literally dividing and conquering a much larger army, but it also is essentially the origin story of Genghis Khan, at least as we know him today. Obviously, his younger self, Temujin, has a super interesting and long backstory as well, but that's beyond the scope of this video, specifically about epic battles. And with the birth of Genghis Khan and this new unified Mongolia, we also see the birth of the Mongolian Empire, which, like I mentioned, is the largest contiguous empire in all of history. At its peak, the Mongol Empire ruled over 23.5 million square kilometers of land, or just under 10 million square miles of land, which is insane. Starting with just one man from humble beginnings in the foothills of Mongolia, to conquering almost all of Asia and even parts of Europe and the Middle East. For better or for worse, Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire was a force to be reckoned with. And the Battle of the 13 Sides was definitely a catalyst for everything that the Mongol Empire was able to achieve. Oh, in case you were curious, Jamaka, who was able to flee this battle, was later captured and executed. So yeah, not only did fleeing not save his life, it also very likely lost him the battle. This was a pretty crazy battle with some pretty crazy implications, but we're only just getting started. Let's move over a bit west and go a little bit further back in time to discuss an army that was extremely outnumbered and a battle that was fought by an extremely iconic leader, someone you're definitely gonna recognize. Let's dive right in. The year is 331 BC, and you are standing in Gaugamela, which today is known as Iraq. And you are a great leader from Macedon, an ancient Greek kingdom. And while living over 2,000 years ago, your name still inspires fear to whoever hears it. Your name is Alexander the Great, and you are fighting a seemingly impossible battle. You have an army of 47,000 experienced and trained soldiers. But standing against you in this battlefield is the army of Darius III, the Persian king of kings. And his army of 200,000 dwarfs your skilled yet small army. It is believed that a majority of this large army is essentially underskilled. However, there is strength in numbers, and there is still a good amount of extremely well-trained soldiers included in this massive army fighting for the Persians. This isn't the first time that you, Alexander the Great, are fighting Darius III. However, this battle that we are about to begin is likely the craziest and most important. Previous to this war, you were already campaigning in the Persians' territory to conquer Persia, and obviously Darius was unhappy about this. But with your unwavering dedication to conquer the Persian land, it was only a matter of time until this battle between you and Darius took place. The last battle that you had with Darius 2 years prior, you were victorious in, although Darius was able to escape. And that is something that you're unsatisfied with. And due to the massive size of the Persian Empire, over that 2-year span, Darius was able to reclaim and rebuild an entirely new army, which is exactly who you are fighting today. The battle begins, and the Persian army sends hundreds of chariots directly at your infantry units. The light infantry units were able to bombard the Persian chariots with bows and arrows, slowing them down and weakening their numbers, to the point that when the chariots approached the units further back in your army, they were already significantly damaged. Interestingly, the chariots that were able to survive were able to not only approach your army, but also pass your army and get behind them. But instead of exploiting this vulnerable position that they had just exposed, they instead decided to make a run to your base camp to loot it, which was definitely short-sighted because this led the army much weaker than it needed to be. Like, just imagine you're standing there, you see horses and chariots essentially rushing your position, and as you're huddled there behind your sword and shield, all you hear is the horse running at you and then running by you. And then you turn around and look and you see that they're still going and still going. Now that the Persians' front line was distracted and essentially gone, their army's lack of experience was exposed, and so was their king. And it was at that point when you and your army go for the kill. You and your top soldiers approach King Darius directly, head on. And as you slaughter his army to get closer and closer to him, you notice that he not only steps back, but begins to retreat. Now, unfortunately, as much as you likely wanted to chase him down and execute him yourself, you simply weren't able to, and it was not strategic. However, the retreat of the Persian king led to a mass retreat of the Persian army, completely eliminating their number advantage. Of course, you still had work to do eliminating the soldiers that were able to get past your defenses initially, but at this point, your victory was already secured. With King Darius III nowhere to be found, and the majority of the army eliminated or also on the run, you now had free reign to achieve your goal of conquering the Persian Empire, after ending up victorious in the Battle of Gaugamela. The one battle that ended the Persian Empire. A battle that undoubtedly had a large impact on human history, as Alexander was able to go on and spread Greek ideals and culture across the, at that point, known world. It just makes you think, what if Alexander the Great had lost that battle? I knew I had to put these two stories next to each other just because of, at least to me, the similarities that they had. First of all, being the underdog story, having a much smaller army but still coming out victorious. Secondly, both of these battles involving iconic historic leaders, for better or for worse. And the fact that both of these battles ended in a significant impact on the course of history. Alexander the Great and King Darius definitely weren't childhood best friends, but during this battle, they were definitely mortal enemies. And if you look into some of the other battles that they had previously, it'd be pretty obvious to know why. A small example would be the previous battle they had before this battle of Gaugamela, known as the Battle of Isius, ended with a loss for King Darius, but also the capture of his wife, his mother, and his 2 daughters, and the control of southern Asia, specifically modern-day Turkey. So yeah, for the Battle of Gaugamela, King Darius was definitely coming back for blood, and I think that's kind of shown by the army of literally over 200,000 soldiers, at least estimated. But yeah, I just find this battle so crazy, and despite being heavily outnumbered, the army of the Macedon emerged victorious due to its obviously superior tactics and pretty clever use of its troops. Whether this was good or bad, I have no input on. I'm referencing these from a historical matter. That being said, let's move on to our next battle. The year is 202 BC. You are currently the most popular living man in Rome. And after campaigning in Spain and coming back to Rome, you, while technically ineligible, become the governor of Sicily, which is a huge deal. And you are at the tail end of the Second Punic War, a war between 2 extremely powerful ancient civilizations, Rome and Carthage. Carthage was a city in North Africa, and they were inspired by Rome and wanted to control trade and land, just like Rome did. The most famous person from Carthage was a man named Hannibal, who led an army of over 40,000 60,000 men and literal war elephants from Spain all the way into Italy, going through the Alps, which alone is an insane feat, but that's really only where it begins. After this deadly voyage, they were able to essentially sneak attack the Romans and win some pretty significant battles, like the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal and his army was able to occupy a small part of Italy for almost 16 years, and definitely annoying, but not necessarily damaging Rome itself. So the Romans didn't put their full effort into destroying Hannibal just yet. That's where you come in. Your name is Scipio Africanus. You wanted to put an end to this Hannibal guy once and for all. And while the higher government really wasn't willing to support you in terms of troops, your fame and popularity was able to gather you a large army of volunteers. From these volunteer campaigns, you were able to gather over 7,000 pretty qualified soldiers, many of which were veterans who fought against Hannibal in the Italian countryside and was also fed up with his shenanigans, to say the least. This is where the battle we are about to discuss begins. A battle known as the Battle of Zama. The battle begins with this modest army invading North Africa, with the intention of drawing Hannibal back out of Rome and into Carthage, which was a success. Once Hannibal had returned, he had put together an army that I could only describe as terrifying. Your plan worked perfectly, and Hannibal returned. Unfortunately, he returned with a vengeance, and began to put together an army that you couldn't even begin to imagine. The front line of this army that you're about to engage consisted of war elephants. Literally an entire line of war elephants. Behind these roughly 80 war elephants stood roughly 4,000 cavalry and 36,000 infantry units. A massive army, to say the least. However, you didn't come unprepared either. You, once again, had a modest army, at least comparatively, but you weren't completely outnumbered. Your army consisted of around 24,000 infantry units and 6,000 cavalry units. The battle began from the Carthage side, and you notice a group of war elephants running from the front line, and they're not necessarily running directly at you. They're running in your direction, but slowly turning and turning until they actually run back into their own army. And this is the beginning of the end. It begins to cause a massive disruption within the Carthage army. You instantly command part of your army to take advantage of this huge distraction and begin to attack their vulnerable army that is currently being trampled by their own elephants. It was at this point where you see the other elements from the enemy front line begin running at your army, and this is something you had planned for. These elephants approach your army, but don't run directly into your army. They run into the gaps that your army had made for them, where at that point your army was able to attack and neutralize these battle elephants, which were essentially used as early versions of tanks or battering rams at the very least. After this, it was a face-off of the cavalry, and the Carthaginian and the Roman cavalry met in the center of the battlefield and resulted in a retreat of Hannibal's and your cavalry chasing directly behind them, leaving only the infantry units behind. Left on the battlefield is your 23,000 troops versus Hannibal's 36,000, and you're on enemy turf. The infantry battle was intense and resulted in your first line of men essentially holding off the first line of the enemy troops until there was an opening for your men to begin the battle. However, as your first two lines of defense were able to essentially eliminate the first two lines of the Carthaginian defense, you now have one line of men that are injured and tired at best. And Hannibal still has his final line of defense, which was his most experienced, most talented, and completely fresh army, which hadn't even lifted a finger yet in this entire battle. At this point, you begin to get extremely worried and question if it's even possible that you can win this battle. Sure, their first two lines of defense were eliminated, but now you have an extremely tired and injured army, and they have an untouched line of assassins essentially. So at this point, it doesn't matter that now the numbers have essentially been even, because their numbers were stronger than your numbers. It was at this point when you call your men to retreat and you reorganize them. You put all of your men into one line and put your weakest men in the middle and the strongest on the outside. There wasn't much opportunity for any real strategy or clever tricks. It was an all-out bloodbath, and your army fought Hannibal's army face on, fighting brutally and neither army giving up an inch of space. Their men's obvious experience and lack of wounds was showing, and this battle was not looking good for Rome at all. And you, Scipio, were beginning to assume the worst, when all of a sudden you hear something in the distance that is about to change the course of history. Dashing directly at Hannibal's army from behind was your cavalry units, the same cavalry units that were essentially drawn away by their cavalry units. And they were coming to your rescue, as shortly after chasing their cavalry units, they realized that the point of their cavalry units retreating was to draw them out of the battlefield, to allow their more trained infantry to clean up the Roman army. Ironically, this sort of maneuver was something that Hannibal was known for, and it is a bit ironic that this is the maneuver that led to his downfall. It was at this point that Rome forced Carthage into peace and turned them essentially into a client state. After this war, Carthage had to give up all of its power, land, and resources to Rome, and this led Rome to become one of the most powerful forces in the region and in history ever. And this victory was also a huge step for Rome becoming the massive empire that we still discuss to this day. So yeah, congratulations on you and your men. But this story is undoubtedly crazy. It's wild to think that this battle is only one of many battles in the Punic Wars, and as much as I would love to talk about those, it really goes beyond the scope of this entire video. But if you guys guys are interested in a video on the craziest wars ever, then we could discuss that. But for the sake of this video, focusing on battles, let's focus back in on the Battle of Zama. I swear I didn't intend on this video being full of underdog stories, but don't be surprised if you're watching this video and the title is The Greatest Underdog Stories in Battle or something along those lines, because honestly, who doesn't love a good underdog story? This battle specifically has a lot of elements of fairy tale battles that just make it so cool. The unlikely leader that rose through the ranks and was able to essentially build his own militia outside of the government, his ambitious plan to take down an entire country, and the noble goal of defeating the person that has been more or less of a nuisance on their home turf for 16 years. That person being Hannibal in Italy, of course. Scipio was undoubtedly a badass, and I'm honestly surprised I haven't heard about him sooner, but I definitely enjoyed learning about his rise to power and this specific victorious battle, where he and Rome were victorious. I also love how part of his underdog story is literally the fact that Rome used Hannibal's war tactics against him once and for all. Like literally after this battle, Carthage was wiped off the face of the earth. But it does make you think though, what if Rome had lost this battle? What would have happened? Hannibal was already on Rome's territory, and they did have a relatively strong army. If Rome hadn't won this battle, there's a chance that we would have never had the Roman Empire. And if that was the case, the world that we live in today would be extremely different. Our language, culture, architecture, money, laws, and so many other things come directly from the Roman Empire. And with this battle potentially being the catalyst of the Roman Empire's success, I think it's safe to say that this battle definitely had an impact on history and that it was undoubtedly a crazy battle. If for no other reason than having war elephants, which is honestly badass. So that's at least 1 point for Hannibal. War elephants, that's pretty sick. Although, as cool as they were ultimately part of their downfall. But I digress. Before we move on to the last battle of this list, I want to make a quick point. Obviously, there is no possible way for me to include every crazy battle throughout history, and if you think that this list is missing an important battle, I'm right there with you. And I encourage you to please drop a comment below about your favorite battle and why you think it deserves a spot on the next list. I say next list because doing research for this video caused me to come up with a plethora of entries that I just couldn't fit on this list. However, if you guys are interested in another video about epic battles throughout history that changed history, please let me know in the comments by saying you want part 2 or even suggesting battles that you think I missed in this video. Now, let's discuss the final battle of this video. And for this last battle, let's go a bit more modern, at least comparatively to these other entries. A battle that is involved in a war that is of personal interest to myself, and I'm assuming many of you guys as well. The year is 1943, and you are a soldier for the Soviet Union, fighting under a man named Joseph Stalin, a person who is not a good person, but he's a better boss than the enemy you're fighting against. This is the Battle of Stalingrad. As a soldier in Stalingrad, you are informed that Germany is planning not only an attack, but a complete takeover of Stalingrad, and over 200,000 Soviet men were sent to slow Germany's advance. All 200,000 of those men died trying to slow Germany's advance. After hearing reports of those men losing their life and the German advance still heading your way, morale was beginning to slip. And before you could even think about what the next plan would be, you hear something from above. It's a German Luftwaffe, a fire attack dropping bombs all over Stalingrad, making a majority of the city rubble and dust. You and your remaining comrades brace for impact as you know that this is only the beginning of a battle, not the end. And soon, you see a German army advance on your position, a position that is extremely compromised. For months, the Germans essentially flooded the destroyed city to continue the battle, and this pile of rubble essentially went from a town to a meat grinder. With things beginning to look even more bleak, if that was even possible, the Soviets had one more trick up their sleeve, and the timing couldn't have been any better. It was a Soviet winter. It was also at this point when the Soviets had come up with the plan to not face the Germans head on, but to try to surround them, which they were successfully able to do, and you and your comrades were able to not only eliminate German soldiers, but circle them, closing them off from any sort of resupplies, which was extremely deadly, as now the Germans were standing in the rubble that they had created, surrounded by Soviets, with absolutely no way of gaining new supplies, or at this point, even intelligence. And with winter arriving, this German army, which was abandoned by Hitler, was left to essentially wither away. Many of these German soldiers froze to death or simply died due to starvation. After enough time had gone on where you and your troops believed that the Germans had to have been snuffed out, you and a group of comrades go to revisit Stalingrad one last time, preparing for a battle, but not sure what you were going to see. Walking through the rubble, you see only emaciated, dead German soldiers and realize that this was successful. And the Soviet victory of this battle was a huge landmark in the downfall of Nazi Germany. It wasn't the final nail in the coffin, but it was one of the first nails in the coffin, for sure. sure. So yeah, not only was this battle extremely deadly, disgusting, and more brutal than we could probably ever even imagine, it's on this list for two reasons. One, obviously because of the historical impact, and two, because of the sheer numbers. The Battle of Stalingrad is not only one of the deadliest and biggest battles in World War II, but also one of the deadliest and biggest battles of all time. And for that reason, I definitely thought I would talk about it in this video. If you know anything about World War II, then you know that the Soviets paid a massive price for their efforts in World War II in the form of tens of millions of their soldiers. And while their efforts were extremely helpful in defeating the Germans, it did come with that human cost. And this battle is a great example of that. Germans wanted Stalingrad so badly because it was a big industrial city, and it was a key to controlling that region, something that Germany was definitely interested in. Stalin obviously wanted to protect Stalingrad because it was an important city and also because it held his name, something that meant a lot to him. The Battle of Stalingrad was a huge turning point for the war. Not only did it stop Germany's advance into the Soviet Union, but it also gave the US and Britain more hope, which was much needed at this point. After this battle, the Germans began losing more and more, and the Soviets were even able to push them all the way back into Germany, a place that they had at that point expanded far out of. This battle is only a small glimpse into the sheer determination that the Soviet army had, even when fighting in terrible conditions, and how powerful it was in the ultimate destruction of Nazi-occupied Germany. The terrifying mental disorders you've never heard of. Cotard syndrome. During the late 1880s, French neurologist Jules Cotard had a very peculiar experience with one of his patients. Her name was Mademoiselle X, and she came to the neurologist claiming that she didn't need to eat anymore. She said this because she believed that she was dead. For some reason, this patient was fully convinced that she had no stomach, no chest, no blood, and no brain. And she knew for a fact that she simply wasn't alive and was not able to die. She told Cotard that she must have been condemned to eternal damnation, and for that reason she cannot possibly die a natural death. As if she could have, she would have died already, as her organs were rotting and she didn't have any blood. And because this patient believed that she had no internal organs, she simply stopped eating as there was no need to, and unsurprisingly, she later died of starvation. This interaction that Jules Cotard had experienced with this patient definitely left an imprint on him and forced him to document everything that this patient was saying and every symptom that they were having. Through this study, he coined the term Cotard syndrome and described the condition as the delusion of negation, stating that it was a psychiatric syndrome that varied in severity. He claimed that mild cases were characterized by despair and self-loathing, while severe cases were characterized by intense delusions of negation and chronic psychiatric depression. Now, although this sounds like an odd one-off story that happened almost 200 years ago, that's not at all the case, and this syndrome still exists today. And while it is extremely rare, there are still people suffering from this syndrome around the world. Cotard syndrome is also known as the walking corpse syndrome. The main symptom of having Cotard syndrome is having a strong belief that you are dead. Many people with this condition simply believe that their internal organs are rotting, or that those organs are missing altogether and they are just existing but not alive. A statistical analysis of people suffering from this study showed that 55% of patients with Cotard syndrome believed that they were immortal due to this condition, while the other 45% denied their own existence, claiming that they did not exist, which is definitely a hard sell when you're the one explaining you don't exist. Cotard syndrome is relatively simple to understand, but I'm sure for its patients it's an extremely terrifying experience. Just imagine being fully convinced that you're either missing organs or having organs that are rotting away, or just simply believing that you are somehow dead. It's almost mind-bending trying to even comprehend the mindset in the first place. So I couldn't even imagine how confusing it is to be experiencing that as a reality. Most of the people experiencing these delusions typically end up neglecting their personal care, refusing to eat, clean themselves, sleep, use the washroom, and also may experience self-harming behaviors, all because that they believe there is no reason to maintain a body that they literally consider to be lifeless. To this day, very little is known about this syndrome, but it is still associated with severe depression, schizophrenia, and other neurological issues such as brain lesions. Cotard syndrome is a very peculiar mental condition, but for this list, it's only the tip of the iceberg, and we're just getting into some of the most terrifying and rare mental conditions. Koro. I want you to be honest. Have you ever looked down and thought, dang, my little bro must be shrinking. It was never this small. Well, in that case, you might be suffering from Koro. honestly, I don't even know where to begin with it. It's also known as genital retraction syndrome or shrinking penis disease, both of which definitely give an odd foundation, and both of which are actually not even fully accurate. And while Koro is a syndrome that does occur worldwide, it is considered a cultural bound delusion, essentially meaning that the symptoms of this delusion are only recognized in specific societies and cultures. Patients suffering with Koro experience overwhelming and intense beliefs that their sexual organs are retracting, and while this literally isn't happening, these people suffering from this disease will go to extreme lengths to prevent this shrinkage from happening. Most people suffering from this condition typically begin by reporting anxiety attacks due to their perceived lack of genitalia, and this perceived shrinkage will be a huge cause of stress for the individual suffering from Koro. And if you're a woman, don't think you're safe from Koro, because there are women who experience Koro, but obviously they aren't experiencing their penis shrinking. They believe that their nipples are retracting and that their breasts are also retracting into their bodies, slowly shrinking. There are cases in which patients experiencing Koro symptoms will have these symptoms for years, and at that point it will be considered chronic. And to doctors, that is an indication of a potential comorbidity with body dysmorphic disorder, also known as BDD. Interestingly, a lot of people experiencing Koro also experience an intense anxiety or fear of impending death, essentially meaning that these people believe that their genitals will shrink so small that they are literally going to die. And this specific belief has a strong cultural link to traditional Chinese beliefs. This sounds kind of silly and obviously odd, but the delusions that these patients are experiencing are nothing funny and truly terrifying. This delusion can cause extreme anxiety, panic, compulsive behaviors, and even habits such as genital stretching to prevent this perceived shrinkage or retraction. The cause for this delusion isn't fully clear, but it is believed to be primarily fueled by cultural beliefs and stress. Now, like I mentioned, if you are experiencing Koro, you aren't actually experiencing any sort of shrinkage of any of your body parts, but what's interesting is that there is a bit of a devious feedback loop that you are getting. Typically, when people are experiencing a Koro attack, they will experience vasoconstriction, which will actually cause their genitals to temporarily shrink a little bit. This actually affirms their delusion and causes a very vicious cycle until the delusion is so strong that it is simply a core belief. And while this vasoconstriction is only temporary, when you are believing such a odd delusion, you are not necessarily thinking logically about this. And even when presented with the fact, it is still hard to come to the conclusion that you are not shrinking. Depending on what culture you're a part of when you are experiencing this Koro, the treatments may differ. In traditional Chinese medicine, typically the remedy that is recommended is a herbal tincture that is applied to your genitals. While in some African cultures, people experiencing Koro will be prescribed a weight to attach to their genitals to help stretch it, to of course maintain its size. Neither of these remedies sound particularly pleasant, and this entire affliction, while silly seeming, is definitely rare. It is a bit unfortunate that your body is almost unwillingly feeding into your delusion by shrinking your junk during these times of panic, unintentionally feeding your delusion more and more. However, typically instances of Koro are not lifelong. Although we may be able to get a chuckle out of it, it's definitely something I would never want to experience. So yeah, Koro literally has men believing that their penis is shrinking and it's gonna get so small that they are literally going to die. And it's still only the second entry on this list. Let's keep going. Body integrity identity disorder. Body integrity identity disorder, also known as BIID, is a condition that I felt made a lot of sense to put here because it kind of relates to the last one, although it's not fully the same. People who are experiencing Koro disorder believe that one of their appendages is shrinking and they are trying to maintain it, whereas people with BIID experience essentially a disassociation from one of their limbs. What this means is that people experiencing this condition essentially don't want either part or one or multiple of their limbs because to them it just doesn't feel like it's theirs. To try to understand how these people are feeling, people with BIID have described it as imagining that you are growing a new limb. That would feel unnatural and you obviously wouldn't want that there. That's how people with BIID feel about their natural born limbs. And people experiencing this condition typically go to extreme lengths to essentially feel normal, typically by seeking amputation for the perfectly healthy limb. Some patients with severe cases of this disorder even wish and desire to become paraplegic. This condition is extremely rare and also uncommonly studied, meaning that there is not much known about it, besides the fact that it blurs the lines between psychiatry and neurology. And for most people suffering from BIID, treatment specifically focuses on understanding the underlying cause for this deep desire. and like I mentioned, for some, does result in amputation. Imagine how you would feel if you felt like there was a part of your body that simply was alien to you, and with nobody to relate to or to be able to give you any sort of answers, it must be a lonely and heartbreaking experience. One thing that came to mind when researching this specific disorder was that one episode of Dr. Phil when that lady poured, I believe it was like drain cleaner in her eyes to make herself permanently blind because she just wanted to be blind. I'm not sure if she was suffering specifically from BIID, but it definitely seems like she was suffering similar symptoms and obviously didn't feel like she was supposed to have the ability to see. But speaking of these limbs feeling alien, let's discuss the next mental disorder: alien hand syndrome. Alien hand syndrome varies pretty drastically from BIID in one major way. People experiencing alien hand syndrome don't feel like their hand isn't supposed to be part of their body. Their hand simply doesn't act in accordance to their will, almost as if their hand was a sentient being or acting on its own will, or potentially an alien limb to your body. Patients experiencing alien hand syndrome typically experience symptoms in their left hand, and what this hand does typically varies depending on the severity of the situation. In 1908, when alien hand syndrome was first discovered, a 57-year-old woman was actually attacked by her alien hand, with this hand consistently smacking and trying to choke the woman, and she had to fight for her life to prevent her rogue limb from killing her. And while this example is extreme and obviously terrifying, it's not the norm, although it isn't uncommon for this rogue limb to do things that you likely wouldn't want them to, like undressing yourself in public, or simply spilling food or drink, or simply dropping things for no apparent reason. Interestingly, while the first case was reported in 1908, the number of cases actually increased in the 1940s onward when a specific surgery for epilepsy began to become more popular. The specific epilepsy surgery that was correlated with alien hand syndrome was a surgery that essentially disconnected both sides of the brain, cutting the corpus callosum down the center of the brain. The corpus callosum is essentially a bridge of nerves that connects the left brain to the right brain, and disconnecting them, although effective for epilepsy, had consequences. And while that specific epilepsy treatment isn't the only cause for alien hand syndrome, it was definitely one of the most prominent initially. However, with more recent research, it has been discovered that people with medial frontal cortex or parietal lobe damage can also suffer from an alien hand. Although, depending on the area of your brain that was damaged, you will get a different type of alien hand syndrome, which is interesting and also pretty scary. Which I suppose makes sense, but definitely doesn't make it any less scary. People who had their medial frontal cortex damaged typically experience their alien hand being mischievous, with the most common symptoms being impulsive groping and the reluctance to let go of anything. With damage to your corpus callosum, typically you experience your hands literally fighting each other, which I can only imagine is a very unpleasant and scary experience. Now, somewhat differently, people with damage to their parietal lobe experience this condition a bit differently, as they not only don't have control over this arm and have it kind of do whatever it wants, they also feel estranged from this limb. Similar, but not to the same extent that people with BIID experience. But just imagine that. Not only do you feel like this limb that is on your natural body doesn't belong to you, but also not even being able to control it. It simply is there, part of you, but it kind of has a mind of its own. That is undeniably terrifying. Currently, the direct cause for why this happens in the brain is unknown, and unfortunately, there isn't a cure either. One of the most popular treatments is pretty simple and basically just involves making your alien hand hold on to an object consistently to give it something to do, essentially. I think being born with this condition, you could likely learn to adapt to it relatively quickly and it could be part of normal life. But I think one of the most terrifying parts about this disease is that it's typically developed later in life, meaning that you can live a totally normal life having control of both of your arms. And by getting brain damage in one way or another, not only can you lose control of one of your limbs, but you can literally lose control of one of your limbs. Like, this limb isn't just paralyzed. It is doing things without your consent. It has a mind of its own. And depending on the severity of what this hand is doing, you may have a violent appendage attached to your body with its sights aimed at you. Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Alice in Wonderland syndrome is a neurological disorder that distorts your perception. Typically, this distortion is experienced visually, and these visual distortions are perceived by objects either appearing larger than they are, or smaller than they are, or closer than they are, or potentially even farther than they are. And as you may be able to assume, this is extremely debilitating. These are only a few of the over 60 symptoms associated with Alice in Wonderland syndrome. The Alice in Wonderland books and movies are interesting and fun and whimsical, but when that sort of psychedelic like experience is your consistent reality, it becomes a lot less appealing. And for patients suffering with this condition, they can experience not only visual, but also auditory, touch, and time perception issues. It's important to note that these aren't necessarily hallucinations. They're simply a misinterpretation of real things that are happening for a reason that is not fully understood. All that is known about Alice in Wonderland syndrome is that it's currently associated with migraines, head trauma, and EBV, Epstein-Barr virus. In most cases, patients don't experience symptoms consistently, but rather in series of attacks where suddenly almost everything in their reality changes. Just imagine you're sitting on the couch watching TV when all of a sudden the TV that you're looking at becomes 5 times bigger and the room that you're in becomes 10 times smaller, and all of a sudden all you hear is ringing and people talking, and it feels like time's moving really slow and then really fast, and everything's consistently changing, and you have almost no ground, no basis of reality, and you can't trust what you're seeing, hearing, smelling, or touching, and all you can simply do is wait it out. But this wait itself can seem endless with the perception of time being so distorted. However, as disorienting and terrifying as this experience may sound, this disease is pretty understudied and currently isn't considered a neurological disorder or a psychiatric illness, and is kind of just in this medical gray area. And currently there isn't even a known number of how many people are experiencing this mental condition to begin with. A reason for why it's low priority to be researched is because it's not considered to be dangerous, which I suppose is a nice benefit. However, 15% of people that do experience this condition have their attack almost instantly followed up with a migraine, which definitely adds insult to injury. And in that case, there is at least pain associated with this disorienting experience. This condition has been seen in both adults and children, but is most commonly seen in children. And while its cause is unknown, during studies of people who have been actively having these attacks, there is abnormal amounts of electrical activity taking place inside the patient's brain, resulting in an abnormal amount of blood flow to certain parts of the brain that process visual perception and texture. Regardless, even with the lack of classification and little known information about this disease, to me, the experience of Alice in Wonderland syndrome does sound terrifying and extremely unfortunate for those who suffer essentially in silence with almost no answers. It almost sounds like a random bad trip that you don't consent to and can happen at almost any time. Something I wouldn't wish on anybody. But we do still have one more entry to discuss. And quickly, before we get to this final entry on the list, I did want to mention, there was at least another 10 or 15 entries that I researched and wanted to put in this video that I simply had to cut for time, because we post videos every Friday. So with that, if you guys liked this video about rare and terrifying mental disorders, please let me know if you guys would like a part 2. I've got plenty more to talk about, and I'd also love to hear if you guys have any recommendations in the comments below. That being said, let's get to the final entry on this list. Capgras delusion. There's no doubt that every entry on this list in one way or another has been upsetting, disheartening, terrifying, and of course, obscure. But I saved this entry for last because I believe it to be one of likely the most upsetting and depressing entries on this list. But the belief that patients suffering from this delusion believe is extremely disheartening. Those suffering from Capgras delusion believe that someone close to them, typically a loved one, has been replaced by an identical imposter. And in some cases, they even believe that this imposter is going to do them harm. Unsurprisingly, Capgras delusions are typically associated with people experiencing paranoid schizophrenia, but these delusions are also present in people with dementia, brain tumors, and brain injuries. How this works is when you see another human's face, your eyes send a signal to the occipital cortex in your brain, and from there, that signal is sent to the fusiform part of the brain. This part of the brain is specifically responsible for facial recognition, which allows you to not only recognize people, but also tell people apart. The fusiform part of the brain then sends a signal to the amygdala, and based on the signal that the amygdala gets, it will release specific chemicals depending on how you perceive this person. These chemicals are essentially the precursor to emotions and help your brain understand how you love and how you care about someone, and who you love and who you care about. Now, for people with Capgras delusion, their brain varies because the fusiform part of their brain is not sending a strong enough signal to the amygdala, essentially meaning you can recognize somebody's face, but you're not getting the chemical reaction allowing you to essentially feel the emotions you're supposed to feel when seeing and thinking about that person. That lack of chemical release makes this person seem foreign or alien, or like something is missing, which is where the delusion comes into play, that this person must not be the real person that I know and love. this must be an imposter. This must be a clone. This must be a fake. And that is essentially how we understand how this delusion comes to be. And while we may understand how it happens, it doesn't make it any less terrifying or upsetting. If any of you watching this have experienced a family member with Alzheimer's, then you kind of know what I'm talking about. How upsetting and how scary it is to see somebody that you've known all of your life simply not remember you anymore, or to even not like you anymore. Growing up, one of my grandmothers actually had Alzheimer's, and during the later stages of it, she not only forgot who my sister was, who was living with her at the time, she also began to resent my sister for seemingly no reason. I can't imagine how that would feel to have not only your grandmother forget you, but begin to hate you and openly cuss you out and disrespect you. Of course, you have to understand that that's not them, that that's the disease, but it still hurts, and it's disheartening to see the deterioration of a loved one. Obviously, Alzheimer's and schizophrenia as well are terrifying and upsetting diseases, but this video is specifically focused on unheard of and obscure diseases, which is why I didn't outright mention them. Focusing back on Capgras delusion, not only do people suffering from this believe that someone that they love or know may be replaced by some sort of clone, but depending on the severity of their condition, what they do about this belief could range drastically. For example, the person experiencing this delusion may refuse to talk to that person altogether, as they do not believe that that's actually their loved one. In other cases, the person experiencing these delusions may actually physically assault or attack these people, as they believe that they have done something negative with their loved one and replace them, and they want to find answers. And in most cases, people refuse to believe any evidence to prove that they are not an imposter. And some people even become obsessed with exposing this imposter, going to almost any lengths to expose the true reality, which is obviously just a delusion. It's for this reason that I wanted to save this condition for the end of the list, because I believe on this list it's definitely the most terrifying and upsetting. And as of right now, there is little known, no cure, and not even treatment available for this delusion. Mental health is no joke, and in this video we discussed some truly terrifying and obscure mental health conditions. And I hope that more research will be conducted to help treat people with these conditions. The craziest lawsuits that won big money. Have you ever been walking through the grocery store when you notice a large puddle on the floor? Although there's no wet floor sign, to most, this seems like something you should avoid. But if you are feeling extra opportunistic, this could be a big payday. And all it would require is you to hurt yourself really bad or to put on a really good performance. Now, nobody gets paid for hurting themselves, but you can get paid if you're in a place and it's reasonably expected that this place will be safe for you to use. Then if it's not, you may have the opportunity to file a lawsuit. And while this system exists to protect entities and individuals, it's not always used in such a benevolent way. Which is why today we're not only discussing the craziest lawsuits, but crazy lawsuits that won big money. Let's begin. Richard Overton versus Anheuser-Busch. In 1991, a man named Richard Overton was a simple, blue-collar, working-class man. And what does every simple, blue-collar, working-class man love? A good beer at the end of the day. And maybe even during the day. And for a lot of people, Bud Light is the beer of choice. Now, Bud Light is obviously a consumer product. And like all consumer products, they come with interesting and fun commercials. Most commercials and advertisements try to portray a certain lifestyle or a certain emotional response when it comes to a product to try to give a product emotional weight in somebody's head, helping promote a purchasing decision. For example, if you're trying to sell a fancy watch, you might put it on a fancy looking person in a fancy looking house driving a fancy looking car. A great example of this is watch any perfume or cologne commercial. Like, there's literally a Christian Dior perfume commercial that is just Johnny Depp playing the guitar with wolves in the desert. You're gonna see it on screen, but that's just what I remember from the top of my head. Regardless, ads and marketing are supposed to be fun and creative and make you feel cool and look cool, right? Well, not always. And in this case, Richard Overton felt like Anheuser-Busch, the maker of Bud Light, specifically betrayed him. In 1991, Bud Light was running advertising campaigns that specifically portrayed glamorous lifestyles, beaches, attractive women, all in association with Bud Light. And these ads, to some, imply that drinking Bud Light would result in a similar experience, which I guess you could say is more or less not unreasonable, but I think most would just assume that, yeah, okay, they want to make this beer look cool, I get it, but not to Richard Overton. Richard Overton thought that drinking this beer would make you cool. It would give you the glamorous lifestyle. It would put you on a beach somehow, and beautiful women would simply flock to you because you were drinking it. But because that didn't happen, he wasn't only disappointed, he was furious. So furious, in fact, that he decided to hire a lawyer and sue Anheuser-Busch. Now here's the deal. Believe it or not, Richard Overton was actually able to find a lawyer who was willing to take the situation, which just goes to show that there are hungry lawyers out there, you know, Better Call Saul type of guys. And the legal claim that Richard and his lawyer ended up making was that the ads were falsely advertising a lifestyle, and due to this, Richard Overton suffered emotional distress and mental injury because the promised lifestyle he saw was never materialized. At this point, this sounds like a fake joke, but I promise you it's not. And even if the story ended there, it would already be crazy enough. but it doesn't, because obviously he won money. And while it's not the biggest money in the world, it's sizable enough to add it to this list. Once this lawsuit was filed, the ridiculousness of it alone was enough to spark media attention, causing a lot of negative publicity about marketing and specifically Bud Light. Which is why, although Bud Light would have had a very easy case to win here, they decided to settle with Richard Overton for $10,000 cash. Not because they thought that he was right, but because they wanted the attention to die down, and they figured if they gave him 10 grand, he would shut up and go about his life. And well, that's exactly what happened. And like I said, $10,000 definitely isn't nothing, but compared to some of the money that people get in the other cases in this video, it looks like chump change. And I'm really curious if he truly felt this way, or if he just wanted to see if he could get some money. Okay, editor's note here, I actually was just going through and finalizing this and realized when I was doing some additional research that this actually didn't get paid out. Literally, this $10,000 was not paid out. The case was actually dismissed. And keep in mind, this case happened in 1991. Even as far as 2007, he was still doing interviews trying to get this money out of Anheuser-Busch. The same $10,000 almost 20 years later. So yeah, my bad. I wanted to definitely make sure I added this in. He actually didn't win a little bit of money. He wanted no money. But you know what? It's already in the video now. It's a funny story. But okay, the rest of them, they're actually winning big money. And the money in each section is only going to get bigger and bigger. Cleanthy Peters versus Universal Studios. In the last case, we discussed advertising being too misleading because it was not true to the expectation. But in this case, we're almost experiencing the exact opposite. Because in this case, Cleanthy Peters, a 57-year-old woman at the time, took her 10-year-old granddaughter to the haunted Halloween house in Universal Studios looking to get a fright, but ended up getting much more than they bargained for. I'm man enough to say that I don't have a huge tolerance for scary stuff. I've never really done haunted houses, I've never really wanted to, and I'm generally scared of most things. So already I feel a bit sympathetic towards this case. But I will say, being somebody who is sensitive to scary things, I know to stay away from haunted houses. But maybe that's just me, because obviously Cleanthy Peters did not share the same mindset. So here's the situation. The story, according to Cleanthy Peters, goes as follows. Cleanthy and her granddaughter both enter the Halloween Horror Nights haunted house, and things start off relatively normal. But then it went downhill fast. And Cleanthy Peters, specifically what her problem was that there was a costumed man dressed with a fake chainsaw that was allegedly chasing her around, making threatening motions, and doing so in such a degree that it not only caused severe emotional trauma, but even caused her physical injury as she was attempting to escape this chainsaw-wielding maniac. It's not stated what happened after this initial experience, but my assumption is that she collected her granddaughter, left the park, and then went ahead to find her Better Call Saul lawyer. And once she had this lawyer, her official argument was that she claimed that the attraction went too far and failed to ensure safety, especially regarding people with medical conditions or anxiety disorders. Now here's the deal. This is actually somewhat reasonable, and I'm not gonna just dunk on this person for the sake of entertainment. I think that there's a very real chance that there could have been, a person working in a haunted house that was taking it too far, maybe getting handsy or aggressive. That's totally possible. But my assumption is that's not the case, and this is more or less of a situation of somebody maybe being somewhere they shouldn't have been. Cleanthy actually ended up taking this to court, and she was awarded, drumroll please, $15,000. And the court and jury decided that even though Cleanthy was at a horror-themed attraction, there definitely needs to be a line in safety standards that are enforced. And with Cleanthy winning this case, it actually resulted in the park reevaluating their safety standards and even their waiver systems. And whether or not they made positive or negative changes, that I can't report. Although they did pay Cleanthy $15,000 for being a little too spooky. Kathleen Robertson versus a Texas furniture store. Kathleen Robertson was a young mother of one and lived in the suburbs of Austin, Texas. Her husband worked throughout the day and she was a stay-at-home mother. So during the day, her and her 3-year-old son at the time would go out and run errands from time to time. On the fateful day of the incident we're talking about, Kathleen brought her 3-year-old son to a furniture store to look for a brand new couch for their home. But this unassuming trip to the furniture store was actually going to turn catastrophic very soon. The story states that during her time furniture shopping, Kathleen was looking at different couches and price tags when she was walking from couch to couch until she tripped over an object and ended up twisting her ankle and falling. Because Kathleen sustained such a serious injury while furniture shopping, she sued. But the twist is this: that object that she tripped on was actually her own 3-year-old son, who was running around the store like a bull in a china shop. Kathleen argued that the store was negligent and argued that the staff should have had better control over the store's environment. If your blood is already boiling, it gets better. In court, the jury actually awarded Kathleen $80,000. Not only did this spark outrage in some, but it also caused the furniture store to go under, closing a small family business. But that's not the worst of the situation. The worst part about this entire situation is actually that it's not real. That's right. That's why I refer to this as the story. This popular urban legend of Kathleen Robertson, who tripped and fell over her own son suing the store for 80 grand, is not real. and I wanted to add it to this list about real situations for the following reason. When I was doing research for this video, one thing I found was that there was a very popular piece of chainmail known as the Stella Awards email. It was basically like a text chain copy pasta email that you would share around of the craziest lawsuits or the Stella Awards. Why they call it the Stella Awards is something I'll explain in a later section. But basically, there was a huge email that was going around specifically full of 7 frivolous lawsuits that supposedly won. One of the most famous fake stories from this email was the story of the man named Terrence Dickinson from Pennsylvania who broke into a house to burglarize it and went in the garage, but he actually ended up getting stuck in the garage, and because he was trapped in the garage, once he was let out when the family got home from vacation, he sued them and won $500,000. I've personally heard the story through word of mouth, and if you have too, you've been told a lie. But that's not where the situation ends. This piece of chainmail with 7 fake stories isn't just interesting. It's actually manipulative, because it's highly speculated that this fake email chain that was viral during the early 2000s was actually used to help lobby in favor of corporations against the American people. Here's what I mean. During the early 2000s, this viral email chain was going around claiming that these 7 real lawsuits won and that they were crazy and wow, our legal system is so messed up. But right after this Stella Awards email went viral, there was a wave of lobbying that took place on behalf of huge corporations and insurance companies to reform the legal system, specifically involving lawsuits from individuals. And because of this perfect timing, it's highly speculated and borderline confirmed that these 7 fake stories was deliberate propaganda to make the average American individual think that juries in personal injury cases were simply untrustworthy and too frivolous, and because of that, reform needed to happen. And even though these insane, frivolous cases not only didn't win money but didn't exist, in the minds of the American people, it seemed like their justice system was just falling apart, and for that reason, it made sense to reform it so that these people weren't able to steal from corporations, when in reality, these corporations and insurance companies were only lobbying to steal your rights. I'm gonna get off my soapbox now, but when doing research for this video, I thought this was too interesting not to include, which is why I wanted to lead you into it with a story that sounds believable and also blood-boiling, but in reality, it's actually corporate American propaganda to steal your rights. Woodrow Thompson versus his neighbor's dog. Woodrow Thomas lived in a nice community in Seattle, Washington, although he had one issue, an issue that he couldn't stand anymore, an issue that most of us can probably relate to. Woodrow's neighbor had a very loud dog. Admittedly, I also have a dog. A small, little, yappy dog that definitely annoys everybody in my neighborhood. And I'm sure a few of you can relate as well. I say this to make the point that loud, barking dogs aren't necessarily a rarity, especially in populated suburban areas. But I guess to Woodrow, the barking had simply gotten too excessive. Denise Norton, Woodrow's neighbor, had a dog named Chopper. And Chopper, according to Woodrow, barked excessively. But Woodrow didn't just claim that Chopper barked excessively, Woodrow claimed that the dog barked to the point of being emotionally and psychologically damaging. Woodrow even went to such extremes as to claim that the dog's barking regularly reached volumes of 128 decibels, which is literally louder than a jet engine. Woodrow was claiming that his neighbor's dog, through a window, barked louder than a jet engine. So even though Woodrow's entire lawsuit seemed almost baseless and his claims seemed completely unrealistic, he still went ahead with filing the lawsuit against his neighbor. Now here's where things get interesting. As we stated, he was filing this lawsuit specifically for mental and psychological damages. But he didn't just want money for therapy or earplugs. He wanted $500,000 because of Chopper's barking. And this $500,000 lawsuit was won, but not for the reason you think. You see, when Denise Norton was served the papers, letting her know that her crazy neighbor was suing her for $500,000, she almost reasonably didn't take it seriously and just assumed that this lawsuit was fake and that it had no base in reality, so she ignored it. But unfortunately, because she never showed up in court to defend herself, Woodrow automatically won, and the judgment was the full $500,000. Because Woodrow's complaint about the barking dog was unchallenged, well, he just won by default, and he honestly probably wished he asked for more money at that point. But for Denise, the situation is devastating, because although it was definitely negligent of her to not take action on a lawsuit that was handed to her, if it's baseless, then simply challenge it and win. She would have had a very easy win here, mainly because no dogs bark louder than jet engines. But now she is trying to go through the process of having the entire situation appealed and dismissed. And right now, that is still pending. But even though $500,000 is a lot of money, it's not the most we're going to discuss on this list by a mile. Stella Liebeck versus McDonald's. Remember earlier in the plot twist when I was talking about the Stella Awards, basically the lawsuit version of the Darwin Awards? Well, the Stella Awards are named after Stella Liebeck. And the story of Stella Liebeck is one you've probably heard before. But in case you're unfamiliar, let me paint the picture. Stella Liebeck was a 79-year-old woman at the time. She was going about her normal morning routine when she drove to McDonald's, went through the drive-thru, got a coffee, and after she paid and received her coffee, she then put it between her legs, opened it, and began to drive off. But when she drove off, the coffee spilt, and she ended up receiving third-degree burns to over 16% of her body, specifically her inner thighs and groin area. And because of this, she was hospitalized for 8 days and required skin grafts. Now, originally, this case was more or less oversimplified and kind of written off as a baseless claim from somebody trying to get a paycheck. But after doing more digging, I actually kind of don't think it was that at all. But I wanted to add it because I know a lot of people think it was, and I kind of wanted to dispel that myth, or at least maybe let you make your own opinion on it. Because here are the facts. Yes, Stella bought a coffee. Yes, she put it between her legs while driving and opened it. And yes, because of this, it spilt and burned her. All of those actions were definitely not smart. So for those reasons, I definitely think that Stella played a part in this, and maybe if things would have went worse, would have been a Darwin Award winner. But here's the other side of the situation. At the time, McDonald's was serving unreasonably hot coffee. And this was proven. After Stella ended up suing McDonald's because of the intense pain and damages that her body suffered, they measured the temperatures of McDonald's coffees, and they found that these coffees were anywhere from 180 to 190 Fahrenheit, which is far above safe levels or even what any other reasonable coffee shop was brewing or serving coffee at. And that alone gave Stella's case a lot of validity. But it didn't end there, because after lawyers continued to do a deeper investigation into McDonald's hot coffee, they had discovered that over the years, McDonald's had over 700 complaints of people who have injured themselves due to McDonald's extraordinarily hot coffee. So because McDonald's was serving unreasonably hot coffee, and because hundreds of people had not only injured themselves with the coffee, but also had similar settlements with McDonald's, there was definitely a case to be made here. But this is still really only the beginning, because initially, Stella only wanted $20,000 to cover her medical bills, which is reasonable and also kind of dispels the myth that she was looking for a fat paycheck. She wasn't. She just wanted her medical bills to be covered. But McDonald's responded with, I'm not even joking, an $800 offer. Obviously, Stella was unwilling to accept this, and the jury ended up awarding $200,000 to Stella in damages, which the judge brought down to $160,000 due to Stella's partial fault in the situation. But on top of that $160,000, Stella was also awarded $2.7 million in punitive damages. And the reason why this figure is significant is because it was equivalent to 2 days of McDonald's coffee revenue. And with that, in total, Stella won $2.86 million. And of course, she didn't walk away with every single penny of it because of legal fees and taxes, but she still did extremely well in a situation that was unfortunate. But yeah, I wanted to mention this one because I think a lot of people were expecting it. I also think a lot of people are uninformed in the situation. Obviously, Stella was not being very wise in this situation. And although her poor choices ended up giving her great bodily harm, this entire situation did likely end up saving a lot of other people in the future, because after this situation, McDonald's reduced the temperature of their coffee to a reasonable temperature. And they were also held accountable and ultimately punished for offering only $800 in the entire situation. I don't think this was a money grab at all. I think Stella just wanted to be compensated for her damages. I think that she was definitely at fault for hurting herself, but I do think that it wasn't only her fault, because if the coffee was a more regular temperature, she would have not have had burns so severe they required literal skin grafts. James Hausman versus a glass door. James R. Hausman lived a simple life in Springfield, Illinois, but he had a dream. He had the dream of sailing the entire world on a cruise ship. And this was a dream that was just about to materialize, and he was doing it on a Holland America cruise. And today was the day. He appeared at the port, stepped on the cruise ship, and began traveling the 7 seas. His cruise was going well so far. He was enjoying every aspect of cruise ship life. You know, shuffleboard with old people, lunch with old people, dinner with old people, dancing with old people, bathing with old people. You know, all of the standard luxuries that a cruise ship can offer. Until one fateful day. The cruise ship that James was on had glass doors. Nothing surprising. But the glass doors on this cruise ship were automatic. And on one fateful day, when James was walking through one of the glass doors on this Holland America cruise, James was hit in the head by a glass door. As the story goes, he was simply walking through the doorway, the door was closing too fast, and it hit him in the head, causing him permanent brain damage. Here's what's interesting. After the incident where James was struck in the head by this automatic glass door, he was still able to carry out his entire 280-day world cruise. But it's reported that his brain injury left him prone to vertigo and small seizures, which are life-changing. When James initially sued the Holland America Cruise Company, the company accused Hausman of carelessly walking into the door and claimed that the incident was anomalous and not their fault. However, that's not what the jury thought. We're obviously going up in money, so it's more than the last one, but guess how much money he won. Do you have your guess? Okay. He won $21.5 million, which is absolutely insane. And I just want to say, I don't think that James was necessarily being dumb or crazy or frivolous in this exact situation, but I think the fact that such a simple mistake could cause such a huge payout is ridiculous in my opinion, which is why I thought it was worthy of this list. Although I want to make it clear, I don't think it was wrong of James to sue. If the door is faulty or too fast, or at least fast enough to cause permanent brain damage, I definitely think there's a reason to, seek compensation. But that being said, $21.5 million seems like a lot. I think this is kind of similar to the last case where there's negligence on both sides. And possibly this situation exposed the underlying issue with these glass doors that were automatic and potentially too fast or, too dangerous. Maroof Hussain versus the Metropolitan Transit Authority. Maroof Hussain was born in Bangladesh and grew up surrounded by family and friends, but as a young adult, wanted to find a better life for himself. And he decided the best place to do that was in the United States of America. Maroof ended up moving to America, and at the age of 24, found himself as a bicycle delivery driver, working right downtown in New York City. Maroof lived a simple and ordinary life until one day of June 2017. Maroof actually had this day off and was going to another part of the city. Like most New Yorkers, he went down to the subway and was waiting on the station. But while Maroof was waiting for his train, he found himself pacing, but unfortunately found himself walking across some uneven ground, which made him feel unbalanced and caused him to fall directly on the subway tracks, the same subway that he was just waiting for. With almost no time to move and no opportunity for somebody to help, Maroof was hit by the subway, but fortunately did live, although sustaining serious injuries. Maroof had injuries to his neck, his back, his head, his arms, his legs, his hands, and the most severe of his injuries were his left foot, where all of his toes were cut off by the train. But here's where things get interesting. When first responders made it to the scene to start seeing Maroof, they assumed that he had intentionally jumped in front of the train. And because first responders had made this official claim, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, or the MTA, which I'm just going to refer to them as now, ran with this as their defense. And because they were trying to state that Maroof did this to himself, they were pressuring Maroof to settle for only $100,000. Now, Maroof was fighting an uphill battle, because not only was he permanently injured because he fell in front of the subway and was struck by it, but now he also had to prove that he didn't do it on purpose. And I think once again, I just wanted to make the point right here, this entry isn't on the list because I think Maroof's crazy or dumb or frivolous or at fault, but I think this entire situation is very dumb, crazy, and frivolous, specifically on the side of the MTA, and I thought it was still worth having it on this specific list. More or less to have a happy and satisfying ending, but we'll get there. Like I said, this entire situation took place in 2017, and it took Maroof years to fight against the MTA and their bullying and their coercion for them to just take the $100,000 offer, but he remained consistent and vigilant. And because he didn't just quickly settle for $100,000, life-changing money in a lot of circumstances, he truly won big. How big, you may ask? Well, he won just under $23 million, or roughly $4.5 million per missing toe, if you're keeping track. But yeah, the jury found the MTA completely responsible and negligent to the fact that they could have implemented additional safeguards, but didn't. And because of this, Maroof was 5 toes poorer and nearly $23 million richer. And it just goes to show, if a company's willing to throw $100,000 at you just to shut you up, it's probably because they know that your case is strong and worth a lot more. Just look at Stella's case. She only wanted $20,000, but McDonald's literally only slapped her in the face with an $800 settlement offer. But because of their severe greed, they ended up paying millions because they couldn't have just honored her medical bills for the coffee that they made too hot. And in this case, if Maroof had just taken the $100,000 and settled and didn't want to fight for himself, well, he would have missed out on tens of millions of dollars. So I guess it goes to show, make sure you advocate for yourself, make sure you stand up, and make sure if you're throwing a lowball offer, you reject it and get what you're worth. Maroof was only seeking $20 million, which is a lot, but they probably could have offered him maybe $5 to settle today, and he probably would have taken it. That's still $1 million per toe. Not a bad deal. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I have some bad news. There are so many more crazy, frivolous, dumb lawsuits that didn't win that I want to discuss, but there's truly no time for it in this video. But I'll make this promise with you now. If you guys enjoyed this video and want another video about the dumbest lawsuits that never won money, leave a like or leave a comment below letting me know you want it, and I promise I'll make it. Let's say if this video gets, 30,000 likes, I'll do it. One of these lawsuits I really want to talk about was a case where a 70-year-old man was fired from his job because the man had extreme gas and uncontrollable diarrhea, but he ended up suing the company for disability discrimination. And well, that situation is just insane, and I want to talk about it, so hopefully that video gets made. The craziest scams in every time period. The Stone Age. Admittedly, this section is going to be rather short, for a couple of reasons. Primarily being that the Stone Age is literally prehistoric, meaning that everything I'm about to discuss is essentially speculative. Also, because most of human life in the Stone Age was extremely simple, meaning that at this point, human life wasn't even able to comprehend the possibility of deception. If you had something that another human wanted, there was two options. Either they kill you to get the thing, or they die trying to kill you to get that thing. That was realistically the extent of scams in the Stone Age. Keep in mind, the Stone Age literally extends over 3.4 million years worth of history. The Stone Age contains 99.3% of all recorded human history, dating back around 300,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first appeared. So with that being said, what are some scams that could have possibly existed in the Stone Age? And let me present you a few interesting opportunities. Scam number 1, the made you look scam. Here's how the scam goes. You are a caveman, and your enemy, also a caveman, comes to ask you a question. You decide you've had enough of his antics and point in the direction that's behind him. This caveman turns around, you pull out your trusty club and hit him in the head. Now, your enemy is dead, and you have just successfully committed a Stone Age scam. In modern terms, that's not much of a scam at all. When it comes to prehistoric humans, things were simple. Just think about that one episode of SpongeBob that took place in the prehistoric times. That's kind of what we're working with here. But besides the petty theft and petty murder of the Stone Age, I believe one of the biggest scams out of the Stone Age was actually the existence of the Stone Age itself. You see, the Stone Age primarily is defined by its use of stone tools, specifically near the very end of the Stone Age. And this is because humans using stone tools signifies the evolution of human creativity, human engineering, human development. Now, you may be thinking, well, of course, we need this human development. This isn't a scam at all. This is beautiful. This is progress. And what I would say to you is, not really. Because look where it's gotten us. As humans, we used to sleep outside under the stars, do whatever we wanted all day, go to the bathroom anywhere. We essentially lived like animals, and it was great. Just look how good your dog or cat has it right now. We used to live like them, but now we wake up to an alarm, we go to a job, we commute, we have anxiety, we have bills. Our bills even have bills at this point. So although the scam may have not taken place in the Stone Age, it definitely started in the Stone Age. And potentially one of the biggest scams of the Stone Age was that one meddling, weaselly little caveman that decided to combine a stick with a rock. And maybe if he was the one who got clubbed, we would still be living that sweet animalistic lifestyle. This first section was a bit silly, but I didn't want to leave this Stone Age out of a video about every time period. But with that being said, as we now transition into recorded history, the scams are going to be historically documented and much more serious. But this is a Trust Me Bro video, so don't expect a documentary. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James. The Bronze Age. Not LeBron's age. The Bronze Age. Yes, that was corny, and yes, we're keeping it in. We are now in the Bronze Age, the beginning of recorded scams. And the scam I'm going to be speaking about from the Bronze Age involves metal fraud, and also includes the earliest ever recorded customer complaint. Let me explain. The year is circa 1750 BC, right near the end of the Bronze Age. And there is a famous copper merchant named Ea Nasser. Ea Nasser, unsurprisingly, would buy and sell metals, specifically copper. And this merchant was no stranger to customer complaints, with one of the most famous examples coming from a customer named Nani. Nani's specific issue with Ea Nasser was that Ea Nasser was selling bad quality or low quality copper, and that was a big issue for Nani. Unlike the Stone Age, I'm not just making this up. This transaction and subsequent complaint is recorded in commercial tablets. These tablets were actually unearthed with a group of other tablets recording transactions and complaints about the copper quality. And these were all found in a home that was believed to at one point been owned by Ea Nasser, which is by itself just a really cool piece of history. Ea Nasser was a well-known copper merchant in his city and was even a member of an established and, relatively speaking, respected copper guild, meaning that he wasn't just any Joe Schmo. However, these credentials definitely didn't help him with his business dealings, because although he may have been surrounded by proper, integral copper merchants, Ea Nasser was likely nothing of the sort. And this is proven by the famous tablet sent to Ea Nasser from Nani, which has actually been translated, and I'm about to read exactly what Nani said to Ea Nasser, and I'll let you decide whether or not Ea Nasser was a scammer. The tablet reads as follows. When you came, you said to me as follows. I will give Gimosin fine quality copper ingots. You left, but then you did not do what you promised. You put ingots which were not good before my messenger and said, if you want to take them, take them. If you do not want to take them, go away. Who do you take me for, that you treat someone like me with such contempt? I have sent as messengers gentlemen like ourselves to collect the bag with my money, but you have treated me with contempt by sending them back empty-handed several times. And that through enemy territory. Is there anyone among the merchants who trade with Dilmoon who has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. On account of that one trifling mina of silver which I owe you, you feel free to speak in such a way. While I have given to the palace on your behalf 1,080 pounds of copper, and Shubi Abum has likewise given 1,080 pounds of copper, apart from what we had both had written on a sealed tablet to be kept in the temple of Shamash. How have you treated me for that copper? You have withheld my money bag from me in enemy territory. It is now up to you to restore my money to me in full. Take cognizance that from now on I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. That was long, but I wanted to give you the exact full quote because I think it's extremely interesting, and I think that Nani is being rather patient and has more than enough reason to be upset. To summarize, Nasir, at least to Nani, is selling low quality copper, and not only is he selling a low quality product, but he's promising a high quality product, and when questioned by the servants that are going to pick up the product, he is not nice at all. He's very combative within these transactions, and not only that, he's also refusing to give a full or even partial refund to Nani after he's complained, and Nani has sent multiple messengers to collect a refund. And what does Nasir do? Turns him away empty-handed and sends him through enemy territory to risk the life of the messenger just to add insult to injury for Nani. I don't know about you, but if I was Nani, I would definitely be sending somebody else to Nasir's door that wasn't a messenger looking for my money back. But even after all of this, Nani isn't even refusing to deal with Nasir anymore. He's just saying that once he gets the copper from Nasir, he's going to go through and verify the quality himself before he buys it, which is something he likely should have been doing, but I guess didn't feel like he had to be doing because he was buying from a merchant in the Copper Guild. But lesson learned on Nani's part, check your metal as you buy it. So yeah, this one tablet that was found thousands of years after it was created went on to solidify Nasir as one of the most notorious Bronze Age businessmen and scammers. The Iron Age. The Iron Age is a very interesting time period, and it represents a change of power, at least in the world of metals, as the Iron Age literally represents iron becoming the prominent metal that is being mined, forged, and fashioned into tools and ornaments and armor. And the reason that transition was made is kind of a long story, but the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was harsh, and humanity as a whole took a step backwards before it could take 2 steps forwards as it transitioned from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. However, the Iron Age is not free from scams, and it itself has a very interesting laundry list of scams that took place, with the one that I'm going to focus on involving silver coinage, debasement, and hyperinflation. Admittedly, the scam I'm about to discuss kind of bleeds out of the Iron Age, but I had other scams I wanted to associate with other time periods, so although this specific scam doesn't take place in the Iron Age, it definitely has its roots in the Iron Age. So I'm going to allow that technicality to make this work, because trust me, we do have some crazy scams coming up. The Iron Age is when we truly see the rise of coinage being used. During the mid to late Iron Age, we see coins being minted and being transacted with, which during this time in history, circa 600 BC, is a relatively new methodology of transacting, because up until this point, all of commerce was conducted through trade, one good for another. There was no store of value. It was simply merchandise for merchandise, no currency of any sort, at least in the form of coinage. Prior to coinage, precious metals were definitely the currency of choice, but they weren't necessarily currency, just something of value to most people, and a good way to store value efficiently, as they were non-perishable and value dense for the most part. Now, even during this time in the late Iron Age, these coins that were being made weren't even used for transacting yet. They were primarily religious objects, typically used as badges or medals. But it didn't take too long for these people that were creating these interesting, valuable medals to create something that had trade value. Specifically with ancient Greek coinage being minted by the Ionian Greeks in the late 6th century, right at the ass crack of the Iron Age. And it is believed that these ancient Greek coins were the first coins ever to be used for transacting on a large-scale basis, and they were made primarily of small silver fractions. But this recent innovation of commerce spread like wildfire through the 5th and 6th century BC, and quickly became the standard, primarily being pioneered by the ancient Greeks and other empires of the time. But this in itself isn't the scam, it's simply the context for the scam that we are about to discuss. This context is important because it anchors us to the Iron Age Age, although what we're about to discuss happens slightly after the Iron Age, and involves actually the Roman Empire. During the Iron Age, ancient Rome is established, and during the end of the Iron Age, the Roman Republic is established. And during these times, the innovation with iron is giving Rome a lot of strength and a lot of military capability. And due to the rise of ancient Rome and then the Roman Republic, we find ourselves with the Roman Empire, which, like I mentioned, isn't in the Iron Age, but we're making it count. And it's with the Roman Empire that we find ourselves with our very next scam. The scam being coin debasement. And this one scam actually ended up being a contributing factor to the fall of the Roman Empire. By the time that the Roman Empire was established, coinage was in full effect and used effectively and worked as follows. Early coinage would be made out of pure or near pure materials, typically gold, silver, and copper. These ingots would be purchased, minted, and then sold into circulation with a face value slightly above their metal value. This allowed the government to make a small profit on every coin that they minted and also allowed the currency to keep a consistent value, as it had an intrinsic value of the metal it was made out of, while it also had a face value of only slightly above that, which everyone generally accepted. Coins typically varied in value from region to region, meaning that in simple modern terms, if you had a coin that had a face value of $2, but was, made out of $1.50's worth of silver, in your region, you can trade this for $2. But if you go to a different region where they have their own coinage, they're not going to accept your coinage at face value, but they'll take it at intrinsic value, meaning that your $2 coin in this new region is now worth $1.50. And this system actually incentivized local trade, as you are going to get the most bang for your buck. But the scam we are going to discuss is the debasement of coin that happened when the government wanted to inflate the number of coins that they could produce, and they tried to do so rather sneakily. There was two primary methods of debasement when they started to use this practice. When the government would mint these coins, they would either make them slightly lighter than they were supposed to be, meaning that they would mint a coin and then shave parts off of it to reclaim small scraps, or they would simply use a poor quality metal. This would save them money and make the coins that they're minting cheaper, while they would still be selling them for the same face value, giving the government extra funds. But these methods of debasement continued and began to progress and became more and more severe. What the Roman Empire began to do was start devaluing their coins by not making them a little lighter or using a lower quality material, but actually reducing the percentage of precious metals in the coins. Early coinage of the Roman Empire consisted of anywhere from 93 to 97% of the precious metal they were supposed to be. But it didn't take long for the government to reduce this number from 93% in 107 AD to 78.5% in 193 AD, and then to 35% in 254 AD, and then 20% in 257 AD, and then all the way down until 5% silver in 270 AD. The impact of this was obviously massive, as this massive influx of token supply and massive decline in intrinsic value of these tokens created hyperinflation, and runaway hyperinflation actually happened multiple times throughout the Roman Empire. As I mentioned before, most of this debasement would happen to fund military campaigns to try to get more land, more money, more power, and they likely justified this debasement by saying they were going to collect more wealth for the greater empire. Although what really happened was prices would rise, and the value of coins that everybody was collecting, holding, trading with was dropping significantly. And it wasn't unheard of for an army to go on a campaign, get paid their money, only to realize that once they go to spend their money, the big paycheck that they thought they had gotten is now only worth a few days' meals, which obviously put pressure between the government and the army, something that no government wants to have. I think it's important to note that in modern times, the creation of money and steady inflation is something we kind of just accept, and it's part of how our currency operates. However, at this time, each individual coin had an intrinsic value, and that was the backing of its value. And even if you paid for currency in your local region and took it to a different region, even if they did not accept your region's currency, they would still pay you what your precious metal was worth, meaning that your money could never go to nothing. I suppose to put it in a modern day context, imagine if the government just said, hey, actually it's cheaper to make $1 bills than it is to make $5 bills. So all new $1 bills are actually 5. And the government just wrote a 5 on a $1 bill. You can still see that it's a $1 bill, but you and everyone else is supposed to act like it's a $5 bill. That's going to create some suspiciousness. And even that, admittedly, is a bad analogy, because the currency that we use today all has the same intrinsic value of nothing, at least not in its physical form. With early coinage in the Iron Age, there was forgery, debasement, and fraud. But I wanted to cover the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire because I thought it was a great summary of what was brewing in the Iron Age at a major historical scale. all. And while the Roman Empire did not exist in the Iron Age, ancient Rome did. And I'm making this point abundantly clear to prevent any sort of misinformation. And truthfully, the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire was the best example of coin debasement I could find. So I decided to take a story out of the future and apply it to the Iron Age to make this section the best it could be. So yeah, Rome was formed in the Iron Age, coins were formed in the Iron Age, but likely the most famous example of coin debasement and hyperinflation happened a little after and involved the Roman government literally scamming its people by making the currency cheaper and worse while still maintaining the same face value. And well, it backfired on everybody. The Classical Era. Although we are now in the classical era, the scam that we're about to discuss is anything but classy and actually contains what is believed to be the first instance of insurance fraud, which is just great to hear that people have been committing insurance fraud for thousands of years. Perhaps insurance fraud is just in our DNA. In the classical era, there was a man in ancient Greece known as Hegestratos, and he was a little bit of a knucklehead. During roughly 5th century BCE, near the beginning of the classical era, maritime trade was booming. Hegestratos was a ship owner and was profiting from this maritime trade that was taken off. And because he had a big and beautiful and shiny ship, he decided that it would be wise to get insurance, which he did. And this insurance not only covered his cargo, but also his ship on any given sea voyage. How it would work is lenders would lend money to these seafarers using the ship and its loot as collateral. The lender would say, hey, your boat is worth 2 gold ingots and everything in it is worth 5 gold ingots. Great, I'll give you 7 gold ingots. If you come back from your journey of trade with 10 ingots worth of stuff, that's great. Give me 9 ingots. That means I make a 2 ingot profit and you make a 1 ingot profit. But if your ship sinks while you're on this voyage, you don't have to give me anything. That's essentially how the insurance existed, and this helped mitigate the risk for the seafarer and also gave these lenders the opportunity to make money with some risk, but obviously nobody was going to be incentivized to sink their own ship or not come back with loot. The whole point of the voyage was to make money, right? That's where Hegestratos comes in. Hegestratos realized that he didn't actually need to go on any adventures at all, and he didn't even need to fill up his boat with loot. What Hegestratos ended up deciding to do was he would fill his ship with things that looked valuable, and what he would typically do was fill crates with sand, cheap ornaments, with sometimes boxes of valuables on top to make it appear that the whole ship was full of valuables, when in reality there was a layer of valuables on top of a lot of boxes of basically garbage. This would make the ship appear heavy and full and also give creditors a good reason to give him a good insurance policy. Already, Hegestratos was scamming because creditors would give Hegestratos an inflated value, essentially. If Hegestratos was able to convince creditors that his boat was worth at least 2 gold ingots and the contents of his boat were extremely expensive dyes and spices and metals, maybe they would say that the contents of his boat were worth 10 gold ingots, when in reality it was only worth 2 gold ingots when the rest was dirt and sand. That is obviously a scam. But now, sure, Hegestratos has a bunch of gold ingots, but he also has debt, and he's not going to go sail away and make money off of dirt. So what does he do instead? Well, he would go take this boat and deliberately sink it. Now, all of the money that the creditor had given him was his money, fair and straight, and he really was out nothing, and he could continue this plan over and over. And it wasn't long before Hegestratos' scam was exposed. And this kind of shocked the ancient Greek world, because during this time, there was integrity and respect for the law and understanding when it came to commerce. And such a fraud was not even necessarily thought of. But when this scam was exposed, it kind of exposed the vulnerability in these early financial contracts and how people could manipulate things in a way that may seem counterintuitive, but would ultimately be beneficial for the scammer. The case of Hegestratos is considered to be one of the biggest scams of the classical era. Not only because it was just so ballsy, but also because it was the first instance of insurance scam and kind of gave the entire insurance industry a huge shakeup and a wake-up call for how they had to protect themselves moving forward when they were crediting people who could potentially screw them over. So yeah, the classical era, I'm sure, had more scams than you could count, but I definitely think the case of Hegestratos is one of the most interesting and definitely one of the most defining of this time period. The medieval era. I don't know about you, but I feel like the medieval era is definitely one of the most interesting parts of history. You have castles, knights, kingdoms, wealth inequality, and a plethora of scams. What is there not to enjoy? It was honestly a bit tough to pick just one scam for the medieval era, but I'm happy with the one I chose, so let's get right into it. There's no doubt that in medieval times, the Christian religion was everything. And this is kind of proven by all of the art, architecture, writings, everything was the Christian religion. And with every fan base comes collectors. And while the Christian religion didn't necessarily have marketable plushies at the time, they definitely had a huge underground market for relics. And these relics were definitely odd, to say the least. Potentially the most famous Christian relic would be the Holy Grail, but it's definitely not the only relic that people were interested in getting their hands on, with some of the most popular and sought after ancient relics being the literal bones of saints. Like, let's say there was a famous saint who was very prolific and known in the church. Well, once they die, if you could get one of their bones, you could possess their magical powers. Like, literally, that was the mindset. Merchants and other saints and even individuals wanted these bones for a plethora of different reasons. Wealthy individuals would typically want to collect these relics to help make their own desires and dreams come true, as these Christian relics were believed to essentially cause miracles. And in that instance, if there was an object that could bless you, that could make all of your dreams come true, that could protect your family and defeat your enemies, is there really a price you wouldn't pay for them? But here's the thing. Not many people had this money at all. And what people resorted to was visiting churches that had these relics so that they could gain the power and benefit of them from a fraction of the price. And that's exactly why bishops and priests would collect these relics. Obviously, they would see the value of these blessed items that could provide miracles as something that they would want to have in their life and in their church, but they also noticed that any church with a relic was gaining more foot traffic, more donations, and became more or less of a landmark and a hotspot for pilgrimages. And this is where the business opportunity arose. Merchants, whether they believed in the power of these relics or not, if a merchant was able to get their hands on a relic at a decent price, they could sell it to almost anybody with money for an astonishing profit. Here's the issue. As the popularity and demand grew for relics, the supply didn't really. Which was great for investors because, supply and demand, but that also gave incentive for others. The only way that a relic could really even be brought into this underground market was by a crusader who would go and reclaim the relic from the Holy Land, or a merchant who would do business in the Holy Land, hopefully trying to get a relic or something close to a relic that they could buy cheap and sell for a massive profit back in Europe. But these two methods were slow and could not keep up with demand whatsoever, which is why some interesting individuals decided to help contribute to that supply chain issue. Here's the deal. Obviously, these relics have absolutely no certificate of authenticity or receipt or any sort of tracking on where they came from. It's essentially just word of mouth. So if you were a respected or authoritative or even just a charismatic figure, you could kind of pass off anything as a relic with enough convincing. And that's exactly the scam that we are going to discuss. Fake black market Christian relics. Some famous examples of this would be fake bones. For example, Saint John the Baptist was a famous saint that people claimed to have relics of, and these relics were his bones. But once all of the bones that were claimed to be his were accounted for and organized, it was concluded that either Saint John had 3 heads and 5 arms, or some people had some fake relics. 2 other famous and common fake relics were pieces of the Holy Shroud and splinters from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. Obviously, any part of either of these items would have extreme significance to history, and even the tiniest morsel of either of these items would be massively valuable. And for that reason, people decided to make their own. At the time, the only way that these relics could be verified is if they actually had provable miracle abilities. So if a church had a relic in it and somebody with a disability was healed, or a sick person was made healthy again, or a dying person was living longer, or a poor man came into money, if any of these happened after somebody encountered the relic would have been proved real. And the people who had experienced miracles from these relics would go and tell their friends and their family, essentially marketing the church that had this relic in-house. But even with that being said, who's to say if these people had experienced miracles from genuine or non-genuine items? It really kind of gets messy from there. Once the industry of fake relics began to become exposed, it was almost a running joke at the time that if they bought all of the splinters being sold from the cross, they would actually be able to build a warship out of all of the wood. If anybody tries to sell you a piece of wood telling you that it came from the cross that Jesus was crucified on, I would probably pass, or at least confirm it can do miracles before you buy it. The Renaissance era. If you've watched any of my time period videos, you would know that I've actually never covered the Renaissance era by itself, mostly because the time period itself is short and kind of similar to the era that took place before it. One of the most famous figures to come out of the Renaissance era was Michelangelo, likely most famous for his statue of David. But did you know that he got his start by scamming? Circa 1496, Michelangelo sculpted a marble sleeping Cupid. It was an extremely lifelike and beautiful sculpture that highlighted exactly how talented Michelangelo was even at an early age. But during the Renaissance era, art collectors weren't necessarily looking for modern art. They were looking for historic pieces, which typically meant ancient Roman or Greek statues, rather than new ones. So what Michelangelo did with this statue of the Cupid was he decided, instead of selling it for a cheaper price compared to the antiques, he decided to make his new statue an antique by intentionally wearing it down. It's not quite confirmed how he did it, but he made sure to make this sculpture look worn. And it obviously worked because he was actually able to sell it as a lost Roman antiquity. And not only was he able to sell it, but he sold it for a much higher price than he was initially looking for. The sculpture was actually sold to a cardinal, Raphael Riario, who initially was fooled, but eventually discovered the truth. When Cardinal Raphael discovered the truth and confronted Michelangelo, he wasn't upset with him, he was actually impressed, and he invited Michelangelo to Rome. And when Michelangelo came to Rome, he was given his first major opportunity in his career, and this was the actual opportunity that launched Michelangelo's career and made him the icon that he is today. This cardinal was able to understand the genius of the young Michelangelo, and was likely thinking that if he could point him in the right direction, he could create one of the best artists of all time. So yeah, as far as Renaissance scams are concerned, I think Michelangelo selling one of his original artworks as an antiquity summarizes this era perfectly. And it's kind of ironic to think that Michelangelo literally had to make his art something else to try and sell it. Regardless, Michelangelo was dope. But when he was starting out, he was definitely clever when it came to selling his art. The early modern era. We've covered a lot of scams in this video so far, but one scam we haven't covered is the fake king scam. Obviously, because you can't fake being a king, right? There's no way you can just tell people that, hey, actually, I'm the king. Not only are people not going to believe you, but you're likely going to be killed. And that's the truth unless your name was Perkin Warbeck, who in the 1490s not only claimed to be a king, but also became a serious threat for the reigning king at the time. And he gained significant backing and support. But before we get to how this entire scam ends, let me tell you how it starts. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the younger of the two princes in the tower, which, if you're unfamiliar, the princes in the tower refers to a mysterious disappearance of two young royals. King Edward V of England and his younger brother, Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. They were both heirs to the throne of King Edward IV of England, but at the ages of 12 and 9, they were locked away in the Tower of London by their uncle, and they were never seen again. This obviously caused a lot of issues within the kingdom, but for Perkin Warbeck, this created an opportunity. Before pretending to be a king, Warbeck was born into a rich merchant-class family and traveled around and spent time in Ireland selling silks before him and his friend came up with the plan to impersonate the younger of the two brothers who disappeared. As this missing person was not only not found, but was an heir to a throne, meaning that if this person was found, they had legitimate claim to the kingdom, which is definitely a title worth fighting for. Warbeck didn't just necessarily hit the streets telling everybody, hey, by the way, I'm the prince and I'm back and I'm totally good. He was very strategic in who he decided to lay his claim to, which was high-ranking government officials. He gained his first piece of notable support from King Charles VIII of France. And this is a major piece of backing to have behind you. Because if the king of another country recognizes and supports you as the lost heir to a throne, you have some serious credibility to your claim. But this didn't last long. As King Henry VII, the current king, had formed an alliance with the King of France, there was no longer support from the King of France to be helping Perkin Warbeck. So we kind of had to start from scratch once again. So the next place that Perkin Warbeck went for support is actually insane, because he went to the actual sister of the lost princes in the tower, and not only did he go there to claim that he was her long-lost brother, but she bought it up. She was like, oh yeah, you are totally my long-lost brother. And now this support was likely even more valuable than the initial support, because no sibling is going to accept a faker as their long-lost sibling, right? Regardless of their beliefs or intentions, this duchess appeared to believe Perkin Warbeck, and with this support, Perkin continued his conquest to claim that he was the long-lost king. The following year, in 1493, he attended the funeral of Maximilian's father, Frederick III, where he was actually recognized as King Richard IV of England at the funeral. And it only took 2 more years in 1495 for support for Warbeck to have the throne bubbling within England. Warbeck was actually able to gather an army of 150 people and attempted a landing in Kent, where Warbeck and his small army were met with locals who were loyal to their actual king, Henry VII, and the Battle of Deal ensued. Most of this army died, and Warbeck retreated back to Ireland. But even in Ireland, he was facing issues and once again fled to Scotland. While in Scotland, Perkin was actually able to set up an arranged marriage with one of the relatives of the king, known as Lady Catherine Gordon. And now, after officially becoming royalty in some regard, the Scottish palace was open to Warbeck to gather his army and begin to plan another attack on England. The attack that Perkin Warbeck and the Scottish king had planned ended up failing before it even started. And what I mean by that is, before the battle even started, they essentially retreated. But the following year, the Scottish king and Warbeck tried again. but this time their landing was different. In 1497, support for the current King of England was low, primarily to new taxes and rising legislation. And for this reason, and because more time had passed for people to sympathize with Perkin, who was pretending to be the lost king, there was slightly more popularity for him on English soil. So this landing was met with some support. He actually was able to raise a rebellion and was declared King Richard IV, the person he was claiming to be this entire time. And at this point, it may have seemed that his plan was successful, and his next plan of attack was to siege the city, where King Henry VII was currently residing. And this siege failed, and once again, his men died, and Perkin Warbeck had to go into hiding once again. And he was able to flee successfully. Well, at least successfully because he escaped the battle alive, but not fully successfully, because the place that he ended up residing applied a lot of pressure to Perkin. So much pressure so that he actually ended up surrendering himself to the English government, because he was promised a pardon if he surrendered instead of causing any more battles. In 1497, while being tried in front of the real king himself, Perkin Warbeck finally came clean about his elaborate scam and fake life. He told the king that he was not the prince in the tower and he was not royalty whatsoever. He straight up admitted to being a pretender because he was promised immunity for telling the truth. But obviously that wasn't the case. After this admission, he was kept close to the king and essentially imprisoned. And a year later, he actually tried to escape England, where he was caught and brought back, and at that point he was put ironically in the Tower of London, where the initial two lost princes were lost from. And it was in here where Perkin Warbeck tried to plan another escape and another overthrowing of the government essentially. That plan was uncovered and Perkin Warbeck was executed in 1499. This was a bit of a longer segment, but I wanted to go into detail because this story is literally insane. In a 9-year span, Perkin Warbeck is going from a rich kid who's just living in Ireland selling silk to, from the suggestion of a friend, dedicating the next 9 years of his life essentially on a conquest to claim that he is the long-lost heir to the throne and trying to overthrow the English king, in which he almost does successfully and ends up admitting everything and then dying because of it. If that's not a scam, I don't know what is. The modern era. Unfortunately, there is absolutely no shortage of scams in the modern day, and I'm sure anybody watching this video right now could name at least 5 to 10 scams just off the top of their head. And that's primarily because of access of information. And at least today, scams are exposed quicker than they would have been at any point in history before. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're exposed quickly enough.